I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey, fanfic family. So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 251 List. Charles leaned closer and asked in a low voice, "What's your organization called?" He wanted to confirm further. Lucia hesitated. "You wouldn't know, it's only recently established, with only about 30 people." Charles didn't speak, just quietly looked at Lucia. "All right," Lucia replied helplessly. "We used to call it Miss Lynn's Station, but we unanimously decided to change it to the Lady in White." Charles hummed in agreement, his suspicions dispelled, and then put away his revolver. A strange light flashed in Lucia's eyes. "You've heard of that name?" Charles then realized he had given himself away. He shouldn't have lowered his guard because of the Lady in White. This codename had probably only appeared a few days ago, and only its members knew about it. "No, I've never heard of it." Charles placed his hand on the table, making an excuse to explain. "I was just recalling the Anglo artillery position. The British shared this intelligence with us, so you believe us, right?" Lucia excitedly grasped Charles's hand. "That's wonderful, Colonel. We'll be of help to you." Lucia's hand was a little cold and trembling, whether from being frightened earlier or from excitement, she didn't know. Lucia seemed to realize her lapse in composure and quickly withdrew her hand. "I'm sorry, Colonel. I'm glad we cleared up the misunderstanding. I hope." The rest was unnecessary. She hoped Charles would lead the Lady in White, but Charles didn't answer. He sipped his champagne, taking only small sips. Lucia's heart pounded. Was she overestimating herself? An obscure organization with only 30-odd members, all amateurs. With Charles's current status and position, organizing such an intelligence agency would be a piece of cake. Why was he wasting his precious time on the Lady in White? As she thought about it, the burning passion in Lucia's eyes gradually dimmed. She wished she had never said it. It was too embarrassing. She even felt a pang of regret, realizing she shouldn't have had such unrealistic ideas in the first place, actually hoping that Charles would lead them. Charles, however, had a different perspective. At this moment, he did indeed need a reliable intelligence agency, whether for military, business, or dealing with political enemies. Although the Lady in White was a civilian organization without formal training, history had proven her reliability and capability, which met Charles's current needs. "But, tell me your purpose," Charles asked, "for Belgium, or for something else?" If the Lady in White's goal was limited to restoring the nation, then they wouldn't have much interest in struggles outside of Belgium, and their cooperation would end with the restoration of Belgium. Lucia was clever. She immediately understood Charles's meaning. Her eyes lit up. Did this mean there was hope? "You don't need to worry about that, Colonel," Lucia replied excitedly. "We want you to lead us out of gratitude and trust. A significant portion of us, including myself, are inspired by you. It's no exaggeration to say you are a spiritual leader. Of course, there's also the factor of restoring our nation, but we don't see any conflict." Charles believed Lucia. Otherwise, they should have sided with Albert I rather than Charles. After considering for a moment, Charles nodded. "All right, I have no further questions." Lucia froze, staring wide-eyed at Charles, seemingly unable to believe what she was hearing. After a long pause, she suddenly snapped out of her daze, almost exclaiming, "Really? Colonel, you really agree to lead us? That's wonderful. I can't believe it." Charles was somewhat confused. This wasn't a good thing. They would gain nothing and might even lose their lives. What was there to be happy about? But then again, historically, they had also asked for nothing in return. This was a group of people fighting for their beliefs. Suddenly, Lucia leaned in and gently kissed Charles on the cheek. The softness of his lips seemed to possess a magical electric power, leaving a slight tingling sensation where they touched. The lingering scent of perfume made Charles feel somewhat disoriented. He instinctively tried to keep his distance, but found himself unconsciously leaning forward. "Excuse me, Colonel," Lucia whispered in Charles's ear, her tone tinged with apprehension and a hint of anticipation. "I suggest we pretend to be lovers. That would make it easier for us to communicate without arousing suspicion. What do you think?" Charles hesitated for a moment. "A good idea," I have no objection. No one would refuse such a suggestion, Charles thought. Thank you very much, Colonel. Lucia's voice held a hint of surprise. She was very satisfied. Tonight's progress had far exceeded her expectations. The celebration didn't end until 9:30 p.m. Galini's lounge was still lit. Charles, carrying a cup of hot coffee, went up and quietly knocked on the door. Come in, came Galini's voice from inside. Charles opened the door and saw Galini sitting at the table, wearing a coat and reviewing documents. This is your coffee, General. Charles placed the coffee to Galini's right. Galini hummed in agreement, picked up the coffee, and took a small sip. It was his favorite flavor, and he'd added 2 sugar cubes. And this, Charles handed him a list. Galini glanced at the list and asked suspiciously, what's this? Charles calmly replied, the first row contains people Joffre placed in headquarters. The second row is suspected of providing intelligence to capitalists. The third row has likely been bribed by capitalists. Galini was taken aback, his gaze returning to the list, growing increasingly alarmed. Where did you get this intelligence? Are you sure? I'm not sure, General, Charles replied, but we can conduct targeted surveillance. Charles avoided the question of the source of the intelligence, and Galini cooperated by not pressing further. The list was compiled by Lucia. Suspected officers were brazenly meeting at the officers' club, some even discussing the price of selling intelligence to capitalists after drinking. Lucia remained outwardly calm, but secretly had already made a record of them. Galini nodded. This list was crucial for the city's defense command. For a long time, the command had no secrets from outsiders, or even the Germans, forcing them to keep their decisions and plans secret until the last minute, only daring to reveal them and hastily implement them. This had severely hampered command efficiency. Now, it was time for a proper overhaul. Meanwhile, Charles was thinking that if he used his own funds to build a private army based on the Lady in White, no one would know about it, and the Parliament wouldn't be able to interfere, would it? Chapter 252 Information about the Lady in White. At 5:30 p.m., Charles walked alone into the officers' club. Lucia had told Charles that this was her shift change time, and the club was less crowded at 5:30. The officers usually had dinner, showered, and freshened up before gathering for a drink around 6 p.m. Therefore, this time was perfect for their rendezvous. Lucia, who had just started her shift, was wiping the bar. When she saw Charles enter, her eyes lit up, and her slightly tired eyes instantly brightened with a smile. She instructed her colleague, skillfully made 2 cups of coffee, placed them on a tray, and tried to appear calm as she approached Charles. Lucia didn't want Charles to realize that she harbored another expectation besides work. It would make her seem unprofessional. After all, in the face of war and missions, especially with Charles as the other party, such expectation was almost a luxury. Missed me, Lucia said softly. She skillfully placed the tray on the table and, as she sat down, had already placed the coffee in front of Charles. Charles stared blankly at the coffee in front of him. I thought you were going to give me 2 glasses of wine. No, Lucia smiled and shook her head. You don't like alcohol at all, including wine. Charles looked at Lucia in confusion. Lucia tilted her head. When other people drink, it's like this. As she spoke, she held up the coffee cup, pretending it was a glass of wine. She took a sip with anticipation, raised her eyebrows, and shook her head slightly, seemingly enjoying it, or perhaps savoring it. But when you drink, it's like this. She picked up the glass again, first frowning, then carefully bringing the glass to her lips. She only took a small sip before lowering her eyes, her face scrunched up like a rag. Her imitation was perfect, reminding Charles of the pain he felt when drinking. He really was like that, and he really didn't like alcohol. He couldn't even understand why anyone would like something so awful. What did you do before? Charles asked, somewhat curious. Lucia let out a silvery laugh, replying half-jokingly, you guess it, Colonel. I used to be an actress. My best role was the clown. She even pinched her nose as she spoke. Charles smiled slightly. He knew it wasn't real, but Lucia was adept at disguising herself, including controlling her facial expressions. Perhaps that was why the Madam in White had sent her here to contact Charles. When it came time to get down to business, Charles leaned forward, his movement somewhat stiff. Lucia, however, naturally gave Charles a light, fleeting kiss on the lips, then whispered in his ear, you should do this, Colonel. This is what a couple should do. A jolt of electricity startled Charles, the faint scent of perfume actually aroused him, and his breathing quickened. Lucia's gaze continued to linger in front of Charles. Her beautiful eyes were right in front of him, and he could feel her breath. A flicker of surprise, tinged with delight, crossed Lucia's eyes. She smiled teasingly, a hint of smugness in her voice. "This isn't your first kiss, is it, Colonel?" "I'm honored." Charles, unwilling to admit it, quickly steered the conversation back on track. "Your intelligence is very accurate, Lucia. I need information about the Germans, artillery positions, airfields, warehouses, and so on. This could be your long-term mission, of course." Lucia smiled, gently stroking Charles's cheek, her voice a lover's whisper, alluringly nasal. "We've always done this, but we didn't know who to give it to before. Now, I finally found it, and I'm determined." Charles almost believed Lucia was genuine, her tender gaze, captivating expression, and intoxicated, fiery lips, until he felt a note slide down his collar and down his neck. Charles believed Lucia's words. She must be an actress, otherwise, she couldn't have acted so convincingly. Charles got the intelligence he wanted, the exact locations of 2 German artillery positions. To Charles's astonishment, one of the artillery positions had been set up just 8 days prior, meticulously camouflaged and unfired, yet the lady in white still managed to pinpoint its location, down to the exact number of 32 105mm howitzers. How did they do it? Did they, like Harley Quinn, infiltrate dance halls to extract information from German officers? This seemed highly unlikely. First, the German military's secrecy regarding intelligence was excellent. Ordinary officers had no way of knowing such information, and of course, it was impossible for it to leak. Second, even if German officers spoke the truth after drinking, they couldn't possibly be so specific as to mention the exact number of artillery pieces. If someone were to ask, how many artillery pieces are in this position, and what caliber, it would be tantamount to admitting to everyone that she was a spy. Charles later learned that the lady in white's method was simple. They watched passing trains from their windows, how many artillery pieces were heading where, how much supplies were being transported in which direction, and how many troops were being moved to which region. Then, they could specifically track the tire tracks in the snow at the destination. The Germans naturally assumed that with so many vehicles passing by and tire tracks everywhere, no one could distinguish which tires belonged to artillery, which to supply convoys, or other troops, and therefore didn't bother to clear them. They didn't realize that while tire tracks alone might not reveal much, combining this with information about train transport and the known arrival of artillery units in the area made pinpointing their exact location relatively easy. Charles immediately sent the location information to Carter. By this time, the bomber squadron was under Carter's command. Previously, Eric had been in command for secrecy, and the military hadn't yet purchased bombers. After the bombers successfully destroyed a German airfield, proving their effectiveness, the military purchased all 20 bombers at a single price of 55,000 francs each. Charles, with a heavy heart, earned another 600,000 francs. Whether more orders would follow depended on their future performance. When Carter received the call, he exclaimed in surprise, "Colonel, your intelligence is so detailed, down to the number of guns and their calibers. The 2nd Infantry has become this formidable." "That's not your concern, Major," Charles replied. "You only need to consider how to destroy it." Note, Carter had been promoted from captain to major. "Yes, Colonel," Carter replied, hanging up the phone and immediately commencing operations. He immediately called the Army staff. "There's a howitzer positioned in a valley directly opposite your defense zone, at 49.16 degrees north latitude and 5.386 degrees east longitude. Mark its direction and distance at 8 a.m. tomorrow." "Yes, sir," the Army staff responded, immediately dispatching an observer with high-powered binoculars and a map to the front lines overnight to locate the position. Chapter 253 The Intimidation of Bombers. Bombing missions during this period were not as simple as they seemed. They lacked navigation, radar, and even radio. Pilots relied solely on a map, a compass, and a ruler. Therefore, even knowing the exact location of a target, or even being able to locate it visually, accurate bombing remained difficult. Bomber formations were likely to deviate from their target direction during flight, initially by a small angle. This deviation could accumulate to tens or even hundreds of kilometers after flying tens or hundreds of kilometers. Concealed targets, such as well-camouflaged German artillery positions hidden in forests, were virtually impossible for bombers to locate and destroy. This is also why the bombers were questioned and criticized by so-called military commentators in France. Bombers are likely only able to attack exposed, obvious targets, such as buildings and bridges. They obviously have significant limitations against concealed targets. I can't imagine how they could find the right position and drop their bombs. Furthermore, they are too large targets. If the enemy has anti-aircraft machine guns or artillery, they are simply a bunch of flying targets. This is one of the reasons why the military hasn't placed large orders for bombers. Their massive size does indeed create a sense of insecurity. Charles knew that these military commentators were bought off by capitalists, at least some of them. They spearheaded the questioning in the newspapers, and other commentators followed suit. This was related to Charles's business. A single bomber could earn him 30,000 francs, and the military needed to order at least several hundred to meet battlefield demands. This meant orders worth millions, tens of millions of francs, or even more. How could Charles stand by and watch it be ruined by rumors? What Charles needed to do was destroy a concealed artillery position, delivering a resounding slap in the face to these commentators. The bombing operation was roughly as follows. Carter contacted Army staff officers, Air Force personnel responsible for air-ground coordination, several of whom were artillery observers. These observers, based on intelligence, determined a specific location and used artillery observation methods to calculate the target's precise bearing and distance. Finally, at the designated time and place, signal boards were used to form a large arrow pointing towards the target, with an N marked after the arrow. The N, agreed upon by the Air Force and Army staff, was the 14th letter of the alphabet, indicating the target was 14 kilometers away. Note, using letters simplifies numerical representation and makes them easier to distinguish. Some numbers are easily misidentified by pilots due to interference from roads, trees, and rivers. For example, 7 is easily mistaken for 2, and 6 and 9 are easily confused. Next, reconnaissance planes were dispatched. Under the cover of fighter planes, they flew over the target according to the instructions on the signal board, circling and carefully observing with binoculars. The Germans had machine guns and anti-aircraft artillery positioned on the high ground. However, for secrecy reasons, the Germans dared not fire. Firing would be a modern-day protesting too much, clearly telling the enemy they had found the right place. However, even their restraint was futile. Soon, the reconnaissance planes manually dropped several smoke grenades downwards. 2 plumes of smoke rising from the valley acted as if marking the German artillery positions. The German artillerymen, still bewildered by the smoke, asked, "What are they doing? Have they spotted us?" "I don't think so. Otherwise, they would have dropped bombs, not smoke bombs." "But why are they dropping smoke bombs?" Before the words were even finished, everyone understood. The roar of bomber engines filled the sky, and several terrifying bombers appeared in the clouds, beginning to descend. Only then did the Germans realize, "God, they've spotted us. Those are enemy bombers, they're guiding the bombers. Scatter, scatter immediately, move the ammunition trucks, quick." The seemingly empty valley suddenly came alive. People were carrying ammunition, dragging artillery pieces, and carrying ammunition boxes, running back and forth in chaos. The anti-aircraft units around the artillery positions and on the high ground were also busy, aiming machine guns and cannons at the direction the bombers were coming from. The bombers, however, calmly flew towards the artillery positions, their wings not even trembling. With the guidance of signal boards and the markings of smoke grenades, they easily locked onto their targets, even slowing down to ensure a more accurate hit. Boom! The sound of gunfire rang out. It was a German 37mm anti-aircraft gun. To be precise, it wasn't an anti-aircraft gun, but an anti-balloon gun, invented by the Germans before the war to shoot down reconnaissance balloons. However, this type of anti-balloon gun proved ineffective against high-speed aircraft. Their shells seemed to have no effect on bombers. Their shells weren't loaded with tracer powder, so once fired, they didn't know where they were going or how far they had deviated from the target, making correction impossible. Firing relied entirely on instinct. Machine gun fire followed, bullets whizzing towards the approaching bombers. Some bullets might have hit, but they were powerless to stop the bombers from closing in. In an instant, before the machine guns could even reload, the bombers had already swept overhead, dropping bombs one after another. The bomber rotor spun rapidly in the air, emitting a whistling sound, terrifying German soldiers who dropped their machine guns and artillery, lying prone and clutching their heads. Boom! 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 A series of dense explosions rang out from the artillery positions. Carter had deployed 20 bombers in one go, unleashing a barrage of 380 bombs like a dense rain, showering the valley below the German artillery positions, instantly turning the area into a sea of fire. During the explosions, secondary explosions occurred on the artillery positions, violently erupting one after another, flames billowing in the thick smoke, as if a fiery dragon were struggling and leaping within. The surviving German soldiers on the mountaintop stared in disbelief at the scene, trembling with fear, saying, "God, how can we defeat the French? They can bomb wherever they want. And we are powerless to stop them." This was the despair that bombers brought to their opponents. It created a psychological deterrent for ground troops. The enemy couldn't help but ponder a question: if enemy bombers could easily destroy command posts or artillery positions every time a battle broke out, how could they possibly fight? The image above shows an anti-aircraft gun from the early days of World War I, invented in 1906. 37mm caliber, used to fight balloons, and could be pulled by horses. The image above shows an anti-balloon gun on display in a modern museum. Chapter 254 Air Combat System. Following this, the bombers scrambled again and destroyed another German howitzer position. The pilots barely rested. After landing, a quick check, loading bombs, and refueling, they took off again. Carter, somewhat worried about their fatigue, suggested their rest, but the pilots nonchalantly replied, "It's nothing, Major, it's practically a vacation. Yes, we don't need to worry about anything, just fly the planes over the enemy and drop the bombs, that's all. I think I could do this all day." The pilots laughed easily. This was the bombers' golden age. No fighters could catch them, and there was no sufficient anti-aircraft fire on the ground to threaten them, allowing the pilots to carry out missions without pressure. Thus, just 2 hours after the first bombing, another German howitzer position was destroyed by the bombers. The two successful bombings instantly caused a sensation in the press. The latest development was the emergency publication of a special report in the newspaper Honors Daily, which went on sale just over half an hour after the battle ended. The article was even written before the attack. At 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock this morning, our bombers destroyed 2 enemy artillery positions. One of the artillery positions was a hidden position located in the Camusa area, which our frontline infantry hadn't even been able to detect, but it was still destroyed by our bomber squadron. Honors Daily did not report the actual bombing process. If it had reported the truth, saying that the mission was successful because the howitzer's location was known in advance, it would have alerted the Germans to conduct their own investigation, potentially putting the White Lady in danger. Charles instructed Cobdo to shift the blame to the reconnaissance planes and fighter planes. Cobdo simply stated in his article, "Admittedly, bombers are unsuitable for reconnaissance due to their large size and inconvenient maneuverability, but the military commentators seem to have overlooked one point: bombers can coordinate with reconnaissance aircraft and fighters. The reconnaissance aircraft locates the target, and then, under the cover of fighters, directs the bomber to the target. Success is a natural consequence. In other words, any target that a reconnaissance aircraft can detect can, in principle, be destroyed by a bomber." The Germans firmly believed this, because that was what they saw. The idea of seeing is believing was deeply ingrained. Anyone who didn't believe it would face fierce resistance from the German soldiers who survived the battlefield. Even the French military commentators had to believe it, because the idea was flawless. It could even be implemented in actual combat. However, in reality, reconnaissance aircraft at this time lacked both high-powered cameras and radar, making it extremely difficult to find hidden targets on the ground unless the Germans revealed obvious weaknesses. Then the media launched a deluge of reports on the bombers, and the tide turned from skepticism to praise. Even the Schneider-controlled Morning and the right-wing Le Figaro were no exception. This wasn't because they wanted to, but because they had to for survival. Ultimately, the media exists to capitalize on hot topics and cater to public expectations. If Morning and Le Figaro went against the tide today, continuing to question, slander, and oppose the bombers after their tremendous success, their influence would be extremely limited. They would only marginalize themselves and dwindle their readership. One day, when Morning and Le Figaro needed to present certain viewpoints to the public, they would find it impossible, because no one cared. The British Prime Minister, looking at the newspapers, fell into deep thought. France and Britain are separated only by the Channel, or to be precise, only a few dozen miles. Even from Paris, the French capital, to London, the British capital, the straight line distance is only a little over 200 miles. If one day, French bombers increased their range. Would it mean they could drop bombs on London without any scruples? No, Britain absolutely must develop an air superiority system including reconnaissance aircraft, fighter jets, and bombers, otherwise, the entire country will be insecure, let alone have any say in the world. After some consideration, the British Prime Minister told his aide, send someone to France and tell them we need bomber technology to fight the Germans, while they are still allies, negotiating cooperation under shared interests should be easier. Kaiser Wilhelm II was having lunch with Falkenhayn at that moment. The lunch was simple, 2 steaks, some fruit, and red wine. Wilhelm II's mind was preoccupied with only one thing, how to quickly defeat the enemy and end his oppressive life. Wilhelm II's life could be described as a tragedy. In his youth, he was a dissolute prince, that was his true nature. But since ascending the throne, everything he did required deliberate crafting, making him feel like a caged puppet under the control of others. If only he could defeat the enemy and end this war, Wilhelm II thought, he could end his life and return to his true self. After lunch, the two men discussed the Western Front over coffee. Falkenhayn remained optimistic. Although our manpower is strained and the frontline troops are under immense pressure, the enemy is in the same boat. They're like a dam on the verge of collapse, precariously positioned before us. I believe that if we apply just a little more pressure, they will crumble before us, and then our army will once again achieve total victory. At this moment, a staff officer brought Wilhelm II a telegram. Wilhelm II stared at the telegram for a moment, then handed it to Falkenhayn, saying sarcastically, "General, why do I feel that our defenses are the dam on the verge of collapse?" Falkenhayn took the telegram and instantly paled. It read, "French bombers have destroyed 2 of our concealed artillery positions. Unlike the 2 airfields destroyed previously, this time the French bombing targeted concealed units. If the French could so easily find and destroy concealed units, could the Western Front still be held? Soldiers on the Western Front would likely be fighting the enemy without artillery, aircraft, or even food and ammunition. The German army should be the one truly collapsing." The Russian Tsar learned of this news at dinner. While chewing his food, he received the telegram and, as if electrocuted, threw down his knife and fork, jumped up, and excitedly exclaimed, "We're saved! If the French can use this method against the Germans, so can we." Immediately send someone to France to contact Charles and to secure a license to produce it at all costs. I believe they will agree. They don't want the Eastern Front to collapse either. This is the best reinforcement for us. Chapter 255 Sharing Costs. Char presented a complete air combat system. First, fighter planes equipped with machine guns were used to seize air superiority. With air superiority, reconnaissance planes could fly freely over the enemy, easily and quickly gathering real-time intelligence on enemy movements. Much intelligence that was impossible to obtain from the ground, even with heavy casualties, could be gathered by a single aerial maneuver. Next came bombers. After obtaining intelligence, bombers could bomb wherever they wanted, easily bypassing enemy lines to inflict devastating blows on key targets behind enemy lines. This had already created another form of asymmetric warfare during trench warfare and was enough to affect enemy morale. The Germans had also considered this model, but their development direction was airships. This German dream was shattered by Char's use of a small rocket in Antwerp. Russia was the first to find Char. To be precise, it wasn't Russia that found Char, but rather Russia through the French government, which in turn found Char through Gallieni. After receiving a phone call, Gallieni summoned Charles. He frowned and asked, "They want to know at what price you'd be willing to license production." "License production?" Charles asked doubtfully. "I'm already producing for the military in France. I can produce as much as they want." "Why would they need?" Charles paused. "Could it be Schneider?" "No, that's impossible." "I won't agree. No amount of money will change that." Charles assumed Schneider had used Parliament to force the government to make this absurd decision. "No," Gallieni shook his head. "Not Schneider, it's Russia," Gallieni explained. "Russia has this need. Their transportation is difficult. In winter, ice and snow make transport difficult, and after spring, the melting snow turns the land into mud. On the other hand, the Russian army is very large, requiring far more supplies than Germany. Recently, the Dardanelles Strait has been blocked, putting even more pressure on their supplies. Therefore, they desperately need bombers, equipment capable of effectively striking enemy supply lines or key targets beyond their defenses. There was one reason Gallieni didn't mention. Since entering the war, Russia had been worried about the immense pressure on its people, and they needed bombers to bring more victories and boost morale. Even if Gallieni hadn't said it, Charles knew this. In less than 2 years, the Russian people would be overwhelmed and prematurely withdraw from the war. This didn't really matter to Charles. He was in business, selling to whomever he wanted, as long as it wasn't to an adversary like Schneider. But Charles hesitated now, feigning difficulty. General, we know the organization and management of the Russian army are extremely chaotic. Authorizing production means our secrets will be leaked. This means our adversary, Germany, might possess similar bombers. Can the Allies afford such a price? Gallieni nodded slightly. He shared this concern. Charles had hit the nail on the head. What Gallieni didn't know was that Charles's words were actually a diversion. The Caproni bomber wasn't really a secret. Aircraft of that era were simple, easily copied with just a glance at the layout, especially by industrialized Germany. Its key technology was always the engine. Therefore, Germany didn't need to go through the trouble of obtaining the blueprints from Russia. It was fully capable of replicating them itself, thus eliminating the risk of leaking secrets to the enemy. Furthermore, Charles continued, this also poses a significant risk to my business. I could potentially suffer huge losses. Gallieni nodded in agreement. Once Russia leaked the bomber's blueprints or secrets, Charles would lose his monopoly on the bomber, and potential customers could bypass Charles and replicate it. After a moment's thought, Gallieni said seriously, I hope you understand, Colonel, this isn't just about money, it's about national security. I understand, Charles interjected. Russia needs bombers to stabilize the Eastern Front, and the Allies also need Russia to tie down the Germans on the Eastern Front. Otherwise, all of Germany's forces will be concentrated on the Western Front. Charles knew this precisely because he had the confidence to negotiate with the government. As the saying goes, a rare commodity is worth hoarding. What does the fate of the nation matter to me? The more anxious you are, the more relaxed I, as a capitalist, should be. But General, Charles smiled and shook his head, no capitalist would do something so foolish. If he did, he would soon go bankrupt because it would be asking for trouble. Gallieni was speechless. What Charles said seemed to be true. Charles pretended to consider for a moment before saying with difficulty, unless what? Gallieni's eyes held a glimmer of hope. As a general, Gallieni, considering the interests of France, was naturally more willing to facilitate this deal. Unless it can compensate for my potential future losses, Charles stated the price. The condition for licensed production is that Russia must pay a licensing fee of 70,000 francs for each bomber produced. My God, Gallieni exclaimed, that's impossible, Charles. That's even more than the purchase price. Russia might as well buy directly from you. Of course, Charles had considered this. Russia can also choose to do that. Gallieni immediately understood the crux of the problem. The Dardanelles Strait was blocked, and if Russia bought the planes from Charles, they could only ship them from the Atlantic. And the bomber massive fuselage would likely need to be disassembled and reassembled in Russia. This doesn't even include the problem of Russian ports freezing over in winter, making shipping impossible. Taking these transportation costs into account, buying directly from Charles might not be cost-effective. Gallieni suddenly realized that Charles was calculating a business deal, and the price he offered seemed irresistible to Russia. Gallieni smiled slightly. You've thought it through very well, Colonel. However, you seem to have overlooked one point. Russia's economy isn't well off. They might be forced to refuse due to their inability to afford it. I know, Charles replied unhurriedly, but shouldn't France and Britain, as allies, provide some economic assistance to Russia? Gallieni was taken aback. You mean, before he could finish, Gallieni understood. France and Britain should share the cost as support for Russia's campaign on the Eastern Front, but the money would actually end up in Charles's pocket. A cunning fellow, that was his plan. However, this method seemed feasible, since before the Dardanelles Strait was opened, Britain and France were unable to provide anything to Russia. If we can share some of the costs for bombers, it would be a way of doing our part for our allies. Chapter 256 Military Industrial Methods. Chapter 2 will be a little late tonight. I didn't get home until 8 p.m. after my trip. I'll resume 3 updates a day tomorrow. I apologize for keeping you all waiting. Charles's proposal was quickly passed unanimously by the British and French parliaments. This was somewhat unusual. Whether in Britain or France, the parliaments usually dragged out proposals for weeks, sometimes discussing them for months, only to have them rejected by the Senate after a long struggle, leading to further discussions and repeating this cycle. But this time, Britain and France passed the license to help Russia purchase bombers built in just a few days. Everyone, including Gallieni, was quite surprised. Gallieni mechanically signed the documents, but his mind was racing. This involves capitalists paying for it, and it's been passed by both parliaments. It would be good if it took a month to discuss it, but it only took a few days. After a moment's thought, Gallieni seemed to understand. This was likely related to the alliance between Britain, France, and Russia. After the Dardanelles Strait was blocked, everyone, including capitalists, worried that Russia would withdraw from the war and remain neutral. After all, Britain and France could no longer provide support to Russia, leaving Russia struggling alone on the Eastern Front. Britain and France's financial and technological support for Russia could solidify the alliance and ensure Russia could continue to commit troops to the Eastern Front to contain Germany. Charles cleverly exploited this psychology, giving Britain and France an opportunity to shine while he profited immensely. The clever fellow, Gallieni, smiled and shook his head. His shrewdness in business seemed no less than his wisdom on the battlefield. Just then, the phone rang. Gallieni put down the documents in his hand and answered the call. It was the Mainland Affairs Council. What? The British government intends to buy bombers, license production? But I don't think that's appropriate, Your Excellency. Okay, I understand. Yes, I understand. After hanging up, Gallieni frowned. He was lost in thought for a moment before calling Charles over. You've got business again, Colonel. Britain intends to buy your bombers. Like Russia, they want license production. The British believe that since you're willing to sell to Russia, you're certainly willing to sell to Britain as well. It's just a matter of price, and our government, they believe this is beneficial to the current war situation, so they agreed to Britain's request and decided to facilitate the deal. Charles simply said, oh, this was not just a matter of price. Although Britain and France were allies, they were also potential enemies. The French government was foolish enough not to see this. Gallieni clearly saw the problem. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and asked, I'd like to know one thing. Is it possible for your bombers to cross the La Manche Strait in the future? Of course, General, Charles replied affirmatively. This wasn't a problem. The La Manche Strait was only 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, easily crossed by bombers. Even with the current Caproni bombers, reducing the number of bombs and adding auxiliary fuel tanks, they could take off from Britain and bomb Paris, the French capital. Note, the closest coastline to Paris is only about 300 kilometers from Britain. So, Gallieni stared at Charles, his tone firm. We shouldn't sell this bomber to Britain. Charles realized that Gallieni knew he couldn't persuade the foolish government and intended to stop the deal by persuading Charles. Wasn't this blocking his path to wealth? Charles considered for a moment, then calmly replied, General, my thoughts are exactly the opposite of yours. I think that's precisely why we should sell. What do you mean? Gallieni looked slightly puzzled, suspecting that Charles was only saying this for the money. We're powerless to stop the British from producing bombers. Charles's voice was low. After all, this discussion was about protecting their ally, Britain, and it wouldn't look good if it got out. Britain is a major power with a strong industrial base, Charles explained. The reason they want to buy them now is largely due to restrictions on industrial ownership. If we don't sell, it will force Britain to develop its own and forge its own path. Gallieni nodded slightly with a no. This was different from Russia. Russia might not be able to develop its own, but Britain definitely had the capability. So, Charles continued, the correct approach is to sell the bombers to Britain, and even gradually loosen the technological restrictions, letting the British step by step into a trap, being led by the nose by us, and eventually becoming dependent on us. Charles stopped abruptly. What he was about to say was sensitive. Once Britain became dependent on Charles's technology, it would be controlled by France, or more precisely, by Charles, to a certain extent, in diplomacy and politics. This was a common tactic used by the modern U.S. to control its allies, giving away various advanced equipment for free, or jointly developing it. The end result was that all the world's militaries became dependent on the U.S. If the U.S. cut off their arms supplies, these countries would be unable to fight and would naturally have to act according to the U.S.'s wishes. Meanwhile, Charles was already at the forefront of aviation technology and had poached Aston Martin's R&D personnel from Britain to disrupt British research and development in aero engines. Most importantly, with Charles around, he could ensure that the research direction remained correct and that Britain remained at the forefront of the world. This allowed Britain to consider using the same methods the U.S. employed to control other countries through the military industry. When Britain wanted to invest in building a research team, Charles waved his hand and said, "No need for trouble, we're allies, what's the big deal? Use mine, I'll sell it cheap." Britain considered it. Research and development requires a lot of cost, is time-consuming and labor-intensive, and success is not guaranteed. There's even a possibility that the developed technology would become outdated. Why not buy what's readily available? So they shelved the research plan, disbanded the team, and bought the technology licensed from Charles. Over time, Britain not only lost its self-developed capabilities but even needed France to send qualified technical personnel. Galleri was a shrewd man. Although he didn't understand business or politics, he could still grasp Charles's intentions. This tactic, to put it bluntly, was to use their technological advantage to constantly disrupt Britain's self-developed pace. Even if Britain had bombers capable of reaching Paris, so what? Once France cut off technical and personnel support, all of Britain's bombers would be unmaintainable and soon become obsolete. Galleri was greatly impressed. This was true strategy, the real deal. "You're right," Galleri nodded heavily. "I'll give them a reply immediately. The rest is up to you." "Yes, General," Charles replied. Actually, Galleri didn't need to give orders. He had already been planning this when he decided to buy the Martin Motors Company. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 257: Professional Price Gouging. The British sent General Winter to negotiate with Charles. The British probably thought that General Winter and Charles were old acquaintances, making negotiations easier. Charles guessed that the British at this time were unaware of the concept of taking advantage of a familiar face. General Winter was confident of this, and he went directly to Charles's office. He believed that arranging a formal meeting at a hotel would be a waste of time and wouldn't demonstrate their close relationship. Galleri was very welcoming to General Winter's arrival. He specially cleared out the command headquarters conference room for the two to negotiate, even arranging fruit and coffee, and had guards stand watch at the door to prevent any disturbance. This was an unused conference room. Galleri didn't care about formalities, and most meetings were simply brief exchanges in the operations department. It was about 30 square meters, with a long European-style rectangular table in the center, surrounded by chairs arranged neatly like guards, and a palm-sized French tricolor flag diagonally inserted in the center of the table. "There's something I must tell you," General Winter said, sitting down opposite Charles, a slight embarrassment on his face. "Although I tried my best, the Admiralty Minister insisted that warships alone could force the Ottoman Empire to surrender," General Winter added. "Unfortunately, I couldn't persuade him." This was expected by Charles. The Admiralty Minister was notoriously stubborn and ruthless in achieving his goals. It would be strange if General Winter could convince him. "Perhaps you shouldn't have tried to persuade him," Charles replied. "Why?" General Winter looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. According to Charles's previous statements, should a well-prepared amphibious landing operation have been launched against the Ottoman Empire from the beginning? Why was he now saying he shouldn't have tried to persuade him? If the Admiralty Minister's plan using only warships failed, wouldn't that have alerted the Germans and the Ottoman Empire, giving them time to prepare? Charles leisurely ate his apple with his knife and fork, explaining unhurriedly, "We can make this part of the plan. You can spread rumors that Britain never believed it could subdue the Ottoman Empire with its navy alone. It's utterly absurd." General Winter paused for a moment, his mind a little confused. If it was utterly absurd, why do it? Soon, he understood, the Germans and the Ottoman Empire will see this as part of a deception plan. They will let the admiral carry out this absurd act without question, keeping their attention focused on the north, where we are really going to land. Charles nodded slightly with a hum. The deception is real, and the real is deceptive. There is deception within reality, and reality within deception. Even if it's clearly done for the enemy, they will find it difficult to guess the true intention. This was just a small trick for Charles, but in General Winter's eyes, it was no small matter. General Winter had exhausted every method imaginable during this period, arguments, lobbying, even going so far as to confront the first admiral head in heated debate, all in an effort to persuade him to take the enemy seriously and capitalize on the opportunities created by Charles. However, the first admiral remained unmoved. While professing to take the enemy seriously, he consistently maintained that an amphibious landing operation was unnecessary, a foolish waste of manpower and resources. In his view, sending dozens of warships against the Ottoman Empire was already a show of respect, even a gesture of deference, leaving no possibility of defeat. But now, with just a few simple words from Charles, the first admiral had transformed his stubbornness into part of the plan. At that point, if General Winter made any moves in the north, such as the assembly of warships and troops, or a planned mine-clearing operation, the Germans and Ottomans would perceive the first admiral's southern offensive as a feint. "You are excellent, Colonel." General Winter's eyes were filled with envy, even a hint of jealousy. "You are a born strategist. Everything seems to be within your calculations." Charles replied non-committally. "You flatter me, General." He said this aloud, but in his heart he thought, "This calculation should also include you, General." Then came the moment when Winter was the one being calculated. Winter seemed to have caught a chill from his train journey. He warmed himself with a hot coffee, pulled his chair closer to the fireplace, and steered the conversation back on track. "You know why I'm here, Colonel. I'm here on behalf of the military to discuss licensed production of bombers. We've discussed it with your country and obtained their consent. I believe we should offer a more favorable price than Russia. After all, we don't have the logistical constraints." Charles chuckled slightly and countered, "Why did you think I would license the bombers to Britain?" General Winter was taken aback. "Why not?" Charles answered directly, "The reason is simple. Selling bombers to Russia is reassuring. They can't drop bombs on our heads. But Britain is not like that." A strange glint flashed in General Winter's eyes, then he chuckled, "You're quite humorous, Colonel. You seem to have forgotten we are allies, fighting a common enemy." Charles didn't speak, continuing to eat his apple. He didn't touch his coffee. He'd noticed he seemed to be drinking too much lately. His sleep was half asleep and of poor quality. General Winter ultimately gave up. He knew that no amount of flowery language or convincing acting could fool Charles. "All right," General Winter said with a hint of helplessness, "tell me your conditions, Colonel. How can you sell us the bomber?" Charles remained unmoved. "If Britain owned this bomber today, would you sell it to France? You might use it to drop bombs on Paris, General." General Winter fell silent. Britain did indeed have this concern. They didn't want France to be able to drop bombs on London without restraint while Britain lacked the same countermeasures. Although France was an ally, this would still exert strong psychological pressure on Britain, causing it to lose some of its international influence. Note, during World War I, Britain was the world's leading power and could not tolerate any challenge to its hegemony, which could even dethrone it from its position. So, unfortunately, Charles spread his hands towards General Winter. "For the sake of French interests, I cannot do this, and I even have to reconsider selling this bomber to Britain. Those fools in the government simply haven't seen this. But it's all right, I will persuade them." Charles's words subtly conveyed two messages to General Winter. First, Charles was doing this for the benefit of France, not for the benefit of Charles himself as a capitalist. Second, Charles hadn't yet convinced those fools in the government, and by the time he did, it would be too late. So, what were they waiting for? Offer a high price, old acquaintance. Chapter 258 Rocket Propellant Formulation. Finally, after General Winter's careful and persistent persuasion, Charles reluctantly agreed to a production license at a unit price of 50,000 francs. General Winter considered this price reasonable, as it was 20,000 francs cheaper than Russia's, especially since Charles hadn't originally intended to sell. His agreement and discount showed he had played a role and could satisfy the British government. However, Charles attached a condition, which he casually mentioned during the negotiations. "Since we destroyed enemy reconnaissance balloons with Congreve rockets, our demand for rockets has increased significantly, but rocket production has been problematic, and we've even had some accidents in the process." This was true. Due to procedural issues, an explosion occurred at a rocket factory, killing and injuring over 100 people. Charles calmly looked at General Winter. "It is said that Britain has a safer rocket propellant formula. Could you please provide the formula and manufacturing method?" Charles's demeanor was relaxed, as if giving it to them was insignificant, not a major technological issue. General Winter agreed without hesitation. "No problem. In fact, I've noticed that myself, and I believe the British government is very willing to share this technology with your country." In General Winter's view, this was a failed technology, one that the military was even considering abandoning. Since the birth of the Congreve rocket, European countries had been striving to improve the accuracy of this artillery, but the results were disappointing. The accuracy of the rockets remained unimproved. If there was any progress, It was that Britain and Germany had found a new method for manufacturing propellant. Note, there are two methods for manufacturing rocket propellant. The traditional method requires repeatedly crushing a semi-solid, semi-liquid propellant at high temperatures to mix it evenly. This method is highly flammable and prone to explosion, making mass production impossible, but what they wanted was accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. What use was a rocket that couldn't improve accuracy, even if it could be safely and mass-produced? A rocket that couldn't hit its target was useless, no matter how many there were. This was the prevailing understanding among European countries, and because of this, even though Europe possessed the most advanced rocket technology, it was never given due attention, while it was the Russians who ultimately popularized and perfected it. Hearing General Winter's reply, Charles secretly rejoiced. With the formula and manufacturing method for rocket propellant, the Katyusha and rocket launcher seemed ready to be put on the agenda. Charles didn't intend to compete with Schneider and traditional artillery. This would not only lead to direct confrontation, but also create gaps in technology, talent, and equipment, making it extremely difficult to catch up. However, the rocket artillery market should belong to Charles. Furthermore, the development of anti-aircraft guns and tank guns focused on improving the ammunition. Charles could use his foresight to seize the initiative and prevent Schneider from taking those opportunities. Charles felt as if he were launching a siege against Schneider, using his knowledge to block Schneider's potential future paths one by one, ultimately confining Schneider to his own small territory, rendering him immobile. For a company, perhaps the most terrifying thing is not bankruptcy, but accumulating vast amounts of capital and connections only to find itself without a way out, without innovation, and unable to develop. Ultimately, he would be kicked out of the military industry due to the limitations and substitutability of the equipment, and even with money and power, he would be helpless. After the negotiations ended, Charles finally got a long-awaited day and a half of vacation. Gallieni told Charles, "I hope you understand that vacations will not be the norm in the future. It's only because the war is stable and there's nothing for you to handle." He was worried that Charles would ask about vacations again. "Yes, General," Charles replied. What else could he say? If he asked for a normal vacation, Gallieni might not give him a single day off. His reasons would be very valid. "Do the soldiers on the front lines have so many vacations? You have indeed made a great contribution, but the soldiers on the front lines are paying with their lives. That's everything they have. If you work a few more hours, you might save hundreds or even thousands more lives. It's the duty and obligation of every adult." One accusation after another would be thrown at Charles, making him feel that taking a vacation was murder for money. The snow stopped that afternoon, but the sky remained gloomy. Winter weather like this is actually quite comfortable, because it's not like the sun is shining so brightly everywhere, making the ground look like a mirror. On the way back, Charles was surprised to find that the road to the town of Vasquez had been repaired with gravel, and the snow had been cleared to the side of the road. Colonel Laurent seemed to notice Charles's confusion and explained while driving, "That's because you haven't had any leave recently, Colonel." "What?" Charles was puzzled. What did this have to do with him not having any leave? Colonel Laurent replied, "It's your admirers. They knew you hadn't had any leave recently and guessed it was because of the road conditions, so they spontaneously organized themselves to clear the snow and repair the road, clearing it every morning." Charles was speechless for a moment. These people were quite good at making wild guesses. But this seemed like a good thing. It was more meaningful than receiving a bunch of flowers. Because he hadn't informed his family beforehand, Camille practically screamed and ran out when the car stopped in front of her house. She gave Charles a warm hug and smiled happily. But soon he complained, "We've tried to visit you several times, but haven't been allowed. Talk to the general. There must be time for rest and sleep. We can arrange to visit then, Mother." Charles shook his head, replying, "It's not a matter of time, it's for secrecy." Since Charles handed over the list from Lucia, the security level at headquarters had been raised. Gallieni had transferred all officers suspected of being informants from headquarters, and the replacements, including the cooks and the officers' mess hall, had all undergone rigorous vetting. Although Camille and Djoko were Charles's parents, they were civilians, making entry virtually impossible. Just as he was about to enter, Charles was surprised to find Djoko and Colonel Estany both there. It was afternoon. Djoko should be busy at the factory, and Colonel Estany should be training tanks and expanding the tank force at the tank base. The military had ordered 500 Charles A1 tanks, and the 15 million francs cost included training qualified tank crews, something Estany had been busy with lately. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Colonel," Colonel Estiny's furrowed brow relaxed upon seeing Charles. "We have some matters that require your decision." Charles glanced at Estiny, then turned his gaze to Dajoka. Dajoka nodded. "We might be in trouble, we were just discussing this." Chapter 259. Chapter 3 will be updated later, currently being written. Sorry, the image below shows the Sanchaman M21 light tank, which has both tracks and wheels. It moves using the tracks when the wheels are retracted. The discussion was still taking place at the dining table in Djokovic's living room. Although simple, it was absolutely confidential. The only outsider was Camille, but she didn't understand and had no interest in this topic. Just like if a woman asks a man if she looks good in her clothes, he will usually reply with ambiguous words, such as not bad or okay. Their concept of looking good is not actually about clothes, but about their state when they are naked. Similarly, when women listen to military topics, even if they listen all day, they might still exclaim, "What? A tank doesn't have wheels? How does it move?" Therefore, Djokovic didn't ask Camille to leave, or even require her to keep it a secret. If a spy tried to extract even a single word from Camille in hopes of analyzing something, he would definitely be driven to despair. A sketch was already on the dining table, with a pen and drafts next to it, seemingly used for data calculation. As Estiny sat down, he pushed the sketch in front of Charles, saying with some concern, "This was drawn from memory by one of my old subordinates. He had the good fortune to become a test engineer at Schneider and told me some information after coming into contact with this tank. I believe it's a new tank that Schneider is developing." Charles glanced at the sketch and chuckled. "Can this be called a tank?" "It's more like an armored vehicle." Colonel Estiny and Dajoka exchanged glances. They had always thought this Schneider tank would be a threat to the Charles A1, but they hadn't expected Charles to be so dismissive of it. Colonel Estiny, thinking Charles hadn't looked closely, further explained, "It has two modes, Colonel. It can use either wheels or tracks, which gives it superior mobility." "Yes," Dajoka agreed, "it can use wheels on roads and tracks on mud or off-road terrain." "A very good idea, so what?" Charles retorted. Colonel Estiny replied, "Mobility means faster infiltration speed. It borrows to some extent from the success of the Charles A1, for example, the emphasis on mobility and the conversion of weapons to machine guns. I even believe they will produce their own 37mm cannon." Charles nodded. There was definitely some borrowing, but because they dared not blatantly copy, they had to abandon the rotating turret. After a moment's thought, Charles pushed the blueprints back to Colonel Estiny and asked softly, "Without a rotating turret, how do you think it can face enemy machine guns and large-caliber artillery?" Estiny pointed to the sketches and leaned in to analyze. "I guess they hope to compensate for the lack of a rotating turret with sheer numbers. They can make the side armor very thin, only requiring it to withstand ordinary ammunition, while thickening the frontal armor to withstand K rounds. In combat, they always face the target head-on. They can approach the target from all directions using their high mobility." Charles understood Estiny's idea. It seemed quite reasonable. If the money to produce one Charles A1 could produce two or even more of these inexpensive light tanks, then the Charles A1 would need a rotating turret to aim at the target. While these inexpensive light tanks could simultaneously aim from several directions using multiple tanks, which was more efficient. It seemed that these inexpensive light tanks, with their ant-like numbers, could create an advantage of too many ants can kill an elephant. Charles smiled and shook his head. The ideal was grand, but reality was harsh. Schneider could never have imagined that various infantry anti-tank equipment would emerge in the near future. Leaving aside anti-tank equipment, these thinly armored little tanks couldn't even withstand anti-aircraft machine guns. They would be used as target practice by infantry. Seeing that Charles remained unconvinced, Colonel Estiny continued to explain, "As we all know, our tanks have the disadvantage of being slow. If they could reach speeds of tens of kilometers per hour on roads like cars, that would be terrifying. It could quickly penetrate targets, Colonel." "This is likely the trend in tank development," Charles grunted, somewhat surprised. This reminded him that Schneider might not just be imitating the surface, but delving into tactics. He was indeed a competent capitalist. He had a considerable learning ability, but unfortunately, he had still gone astray. "It will not be the trend in tank development," Charles said firmly. "We can't be sure, Colonel," Colonel Estiny said, his voice trembling with confusion and anxiety. "If it's not the trend, then what is? I can't think of any reform options." Hearing this, Charles finally understood Colonel Estiny's mindset. He believed that any equipment needed to be modified during its development, whether in its core, structure, or form. After the Charles A1 tank was released, Colonel Estini hoped to improve it but found it was beyond modification, plunging him into despair, believing he was stagnant. Then, Schneider suddenly developed a more mobile tank, and Colonel Estini mistakenly assumed that was the improvement, the trend. This seemed ridiculous to Charles, a modern man, but for people of this era, unaware of the future development of tanks, confusion and bewilderment were perhaps only natural. Charles hesitated for a moment, then asked unhurriedly, "How heavy is it?" "I'm not sure," Colonel Estini replied, "but it's said that Schneider's philosophy is to make it lightweight, and its weight is likely only half that of the Charles A1. Note, the Saint Chamond's actual weight is only 3.3 tons, less than half the 8-ton Charles A1. Estini added, "The test results show that it can reach a speed of 28 kilometers per hour on the road. This is only preliminary testing, it may be faster in the future." A hint of fear flashed in Colonel Estini's eyes as he spoke. He seemed to see a swarm of these light tanks speeding along the roads, dividing and encircling the enemy. Wasn't this the template for Charles's several battles on the front lines? Djoka also showed a cautious expression. Estini had described it to him before, and it even fit Colonel Estini's long-conceived swarm warfare theory, or rather, only such fast light tanks could realize his operational theory. Charles chuckled and said, "Perhaps we can think of it this way. If this light tank were facing the Char A1 instead of the German heavy tanks, which tank do you think would win?" Estini and Djokovic exchanged glances. Neither of them had considered this possibility. The image above shows the Saint-Chamond M21 light tank with its wheels folded. The image above shows it with its wheels extended. Chapter 260 The Development Direction of Tanks. After a moment's thought, Colonel Estini replied, "I understand your meaning, Colonel. In a one-on-one situation, the Char A1 might have an advantage. But against a group of these tanks, the Char A1 might be outmatched. Moreover, Schneider could modify this tank into a rotating turret, at which point the Char A1 would have no advantage whatsoever. Simply put, this tank could have everything the Char A1 had, plus the added advantage of mobility. How could the Char A1 possibly defeat it?" The Char was almost rendered speechless by Estini's words. Perhaps the success of the Char A1 had swayed tank development at this time, causing tank warfare theory to suddenly shift from super-heavy tanks like the Saint-Chamond and A7V to the other extreme, ultra-light tanks. This was very French. They always tried to find an absolutely correct theory, and then do nothing but adhere to it, hoping to achieve victory. However, the complexity and variability of the battlefield determined that this approach was destined to fail. Charles replied slowly and deliberately, "I think the problem you're considering is non-existent, Colonel. Tank warfare mostly takes place off-road. You don't deny that, do you?" Colonel Estini nodded. "There have been no known examples of tanks fighting on roads. Even if intercepted on a road, the battle would still proceed off-road. Therefore," Charles took the sketch and pointed to the wheels on it, "in combat, its wheels are completely useless. Its mobility in combat relies solely on its tracks, not wheels." Estini didn't deny that wheels were for flanking maneuvers, not combat. Charles continued, "Since its wheel configuration only reaches a speed of 28 kilometers per hour on roads, I boldly guess that its tracks can only travel at speeds of around 10 kilometers per hour. Do you agree?" Estini hesitated slightly, then nodded and replied, "Agreed. If the tracks of this Schneider light tank could reach speeds of 20 kilometers per hour, then wheels wouldn't be necessary at all. On the other hand, the Char A1, with its more advanced suspension, can reach a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour, so its track speed should be similar to that of this light tank. In that case," Char concluded with a question, "how can a light tank weighing only about 4 tons defeat the 8-ton Char A1? Estini paused, then suddenly understood. Djoka, however, was completely confused. He hesitated, looking at Estini and then at Char. "This, can weight determine the winner? It's hard to believe, but it seems to be true," Colonel Estini explained. "Under the same technological conditions and with similar speeds, a heavier tank means thicker armor, meaning I can penetrate it while it can't penetrate mine." Djoka nodded with a no. The logic was actually quite simple. Schneider and Char were both French arms manufacturers, and their light tanks used similar engines and weaponry. Greater weight necessarily meant thicker armor, and thicker armor meant a greater defensive advantage in combat. Charles said nothing more, simply watching the two silently. Colonel Estini was lost in thought for a moment, then suddenly realized with a start, "God, I might know what the future development trend of tanks is. Djoka looked confused. What? He didn't understand how this could be analyzed as a development trend. Colonel Astini turned to Charles, his face showing some uncertainty, his voice slightly excited. If weight can determine combat effectiveness, then could it be explained that, while ensuring a certain speed and mobility, we should increase armor as much as possible? Then Astini seemed to remember something, and he added, so that's why you sent Matthew to the aircraft manufacturing plant to learn engine technology. Charles nodded slightly. That was 2 weeks ago, when the aircraft manufacturing plant's R&D department was short-staffed while producing bombers, and Charles took the opportunity to transfer Matthew to help. Djoka was even more confused. What did engine technology have to do with increasing armor thickness? After a moment's thought, he seemed to understand. More advanced engine technology and greater horsepower meant it could carry thicker armor, inevitably resulting in stronger protection. Charles added earnestly, the purpose of a tank has never been to have more fancy functions, Colonel. Battlefield equipment has one most basic and crucial commonality: preserve yourself and destroy the enemy. Any equipment will be fine if you think about it from this perspective. Astini suddenly realized, a light tank like the Schneider, while having greater mobility, cannot preserve itself. It even has difficulty breaking through enemy lines. God, if it cannot break through enemy lines, its road mobility might be useless, meaning it's a redundant, useless function, and could even increase logistical burden. Charles nodded to himself. After all, he was the father of French armor, understanding immediately. At this moment, Astini seemed to have entered another state. He repeatedly pondered Charles's words, muttering to himself, so destroying the enemy means artillery. Yes, artillery. Artillery should have a longer range. Astini looked at Charles excitedly, his voice trembling with excitement. I wasn't wrong, Colonel. Artillery is developing towards a longer range, and penetration power, striving to penetrate enemy tanks at a greater distance. Charles nodded slightly. That's right, Colonel. This is the future trend of tank development. It doesn't need too many changes, just a balance between mobility, defense, and firepower, and the core that determines all of this. Colonel Astini interjected, it's the engine. The engine determines everything. Only when the engine reaches a certain level can tanks carry thicker armor and larger caliber cannons. Otherwise, they will be like the St. Chaman and A7V, underpowered and unable to even move normally on the battlefield, let alone fight. At that moment, Astini suddenly realized that Charles had been reluctant to equip the Mark I tank with a cannon, and the Charles A1 tank only had a small 37mm cannon, seemingly due to considerations of overall performance. This realization left Astini utterly astonished. Could it be that Charles already knew this direction back then? But, tanks had only just appeared and had no rivals yet. How could Charles have foreseen future development? He had actually considered things so far ahead. Chapter 261: A higher position. Perhaps due to unfamiliarity, after serving at headquarters for over half a month, Charles only wanted to stay home during his leave and didn't want to go anywhere. He used to visit the motorcycle and tractor factories every time he came back from leave, but now he had no desire to do anything. He made an excuse for himself. Djoka would handle the business anyway, so there was no point in going. Another reason, Charles was now easily earning tens of millions of francs through licensed production, licenses to the US, Russia, and Britain, with estimated profits of tens of millions each. With money so easily made, Charles no longer cared about the profits from the tractor and motorcycle factories. Let them go, it was just a drop in the ocean. If it weren't for their connection to the military industry, the tractor factories' engines being directly related to tank development, Charles wouldn't have bothered keeping them. Thinking about that detestable Francis, he had recently toned it down considerably. After all, Charles was a formidable competitor that Schneider feared, while Francis was merely a pawn in Schneider's game. The difference in their status was obvious. If Charles wanted to, he could easily destroy Francis's tractor factory without much effort. Even Schneider's backing wouldn't help. Note, if Charles were to focus all his efforts on Francis, Schneider would more likely choose to abandon his pawn rather than wage a full-scale war against Charles for him, but Charles felt it was pointless. He had unknowingly left Francis far behind, and fighting him would only lower his own standing. Charles suddenly felt nostalgic for the modern electronic age. If he had a mobile phone, he could read novels in his spare time at home. Especially Steel Wing Iron Riders, he had only read half of it before he was transported to another world. The next afternoon, Charles still braved the heavy snow to visit the factory. He didn't go to the motorcycle factory or the tractor factory, but to the Veterans Welfare Home to see Captain Darius, the director. The Veterans Welfare Home was different now. When it was first built, it was an old building used as a motorcycle rental. Because so many wounded and disabled veterans came to seek refuge, there was a shortage of dormitories, and many people lived in factory buildings and makeshift tents. Last month, Charles built a 5-story building at the welfare home, with over 300 dormitories, each with ensuite bathrooms, accommodating 10 people. Another building of similar size is under construction, which will eventually house 7 or 8,000 disabled veterans. This cost Charles over 3 million francs, but he believes it was all worthwhile. It's an investment, and now is the time to put them to use. Charles found Captain Darius at the factory. As the director, Darius has always been diligent and conscientious, trying every possible way to help the disabled veterans overcome their disabilities and do what they can. This is not easy, because each veteran's injury is different, and Darius must carefully consider each person's needs, even their ability to care for themselves. For example, he had 2 veterans, one missing a leg and the other missing a hand, work together. Seeing their difficult work, Charles felt a pang of pity. But Charles knew that for these veterans, this was not just work, but dignity, self-confidence, and even the meaning of life. Otherwise, they would only be a burden on their families and lie in bed waiting to die. Charles entered the factory, causing a stir throughout the entire plant. The workers spontaneously stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at him. Many of the wounded veterans had never seen Charles before, and they murmured amongst themselves, "Is that young Master Charles? We've finally met him. Today is our lucky day, gentlemen. I hope to have the opportunity to thank him in person." "Forget it, Ambroise, young Master Charles is very busy." Unexpectedly, Charles strolled into the crowd, shaking hands with the veterans and greeting them. "How are you, gentlemen?" The veterans rushed forward, answering all at once. "Thanks to you, we are fine, young Master Charles. We have nothing to complain about, young Master Charles. We are not only alive, but we can also send extra wages to our families. I love it here, young Master Charles. We can help each other." Charles nodded to them, his eyes filled with heartfelt respect. Charles felt these veterans before him were remarkable men. They had given everything for France, and France shouldn't so easily dismiss them with just 130 francs. The veterans understood Charles's expression, though he said nothing, they understood. They didn't know how to express themselves, only repeatedly thanking Charles, some even with tears welling in their eyes. More than work and wages, they needed this recognition. Captain Darius led Charles to his office. The office was simple, with a desk, chair, and bookshelves. Everything was there, except for the French flag. It was impeccably organized, everything looked brand new, which seemed somewhat incongruous with Darius's single arm. Darius understood Charles's expression. He skillfully brewed coffee with his only right hand and explained, "You might not believe it, young Master Charles, but I used to be notoriously slovenly. Now, with only one hand, I can actually keep the house clean." Darius chuckled self-deprecatingly and handed the coffee to Charles. "Some say it's a personality change after a brush with death, but I don't think so." "Then what is it?" Charles asked, taking the coffee. Darius turned back, took his own coffee, took a sip, and sat down opposite Charles, replying, "Before, I always thought I could accomplish great things and didn't care about these small things. Now, I consider these my career." Darius waved towards the factory outside the office, smiling. "This is meaningful. I feel I've found my place while helping others." "You've indeed managed this place very well," Charles praised sincerely. No, Darius replied, "please don't say thank you. I did all this not for you, nor for anyone else, but for myself. I even feel that I was the one who wasted my life before." Charles nodded in understanding. "Life is often like this, only when you lose something do you truly understand and find the meaning of life. Otherwise, you drift through life in a daze, never knowing what you want to do." This put Charles in a dilemma. He wasn't sure if coming here was the right thing to do. It might disrupt Darius's peace. Seeing the change in Charles's expression, Darius suddenly became nervous. "Young Master Charles, you're not planning to close the orphanage, are you?" Before Charles could answer, he added, "If you're short on funds, you don't need to subsidize the orphanage anymore. We can be self-sufficient. Please don't close it down." Darius looked at Charles with pleading eyes, and a hint of panic. "No, Captain," Charles replied, I have no intention of closing it down. As long as I'm alive, the subsidies will continue." Then, Darius looked at Charles in confusion. Charles countered, "Captain, if things don't turn out the way you think, you might have a higher position." Chapter 262 Naked Interests. Chapter 3 will be a bit late again. Sorry, I just got back these past 2 days and haven't quite recovered yet. Darius paused for a moment, then laughed. He glanced at his empty left sleeve and answered confidently, "I won't be promoted, Colonel." Charles didn't argue much. He asked calmly, "You should know about my passive situation in the council, right?" "Of course." Darius nodded, then indignantly cursed, "Those stupid guys, they're always being used by capitalists. If it weren't for your powerful demonstrations on the battlefield time and time again, they might still be spending money to buy large quantities of useless equipment." Darius was referring to the Saint-Chamond and the CA-1 tank. This was common knowledge. Capitalists had repeatedly defeated Charles's tanks through the council, but actual combat had repeatedly proven that Charles's tanks were what the battlefield truly needed. Darius and his fellow veterans understood this more deeply. Capitalists controlled the council to buy this equipment for profit, but the price was paid by the soldiers fighting on the front lines. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers lost their lives or were maimed because of the capitalists' mistakes, yet the capitalists bore no responsibility for their errors. Charles nodded, "If we let this continue, it will continue to happen, and it will go on forever." Darius agreed. Capitalists wouldn't give up any opportunity to make money. For example, even now, the Saint-Chamond and CA-1, proven useless and even called mobile coffins, were still getting orders. But after a moment's hesitation, Darius asked, puzzled, "But what can I do?" Then Darius seemed to understand. "I understand. I'll organize a demonstration tomorrow. We'll let them hear the voices of us veterans, let them understand that this is wrong." "No, Captain," Charles interrupted Darius, "they won't heed these voices. They might send troops to suppress them, and they might even hold me responsible." Darius fell silent. Although it seemed absurd, it was indeed the case. Because the veterans had survived with Charles's help, people naturally assumed it was a demonstration organized by Charles. Charles revealed the truth. "What I hope for is that someone can speak up for veterans and soldiers on the front lines in the House of Representatives." Darius froze instantly. He had considered several possibilities, but he had never imagined Charles would place such a high regard in his position. "Young Master Charles," Darius stammered nervously, that means we're going to establish a political party." "You're the one who wants to establish a political party," Charles emphasized. Darius suddenly realized that Charles's military status did not allow him to participate in politics unless he could retire from the military like Bewilder. Yes, Darius swallowed hard. "It's me, of course it's me. I want to establish a political party." Then Darius added hesitantly, "But, Master Charles, I might not be cut out for it at all. No one will listen to me, I have no influence, no one will want to follow me." Charles didn't answer, but simply gestured with his chin towards the factory outside the window. Darius instantly understood. It didn't matter that he lacked influence, Charles did. All he had to do was organize Charles's supporters. Thinking this, Darius gradually gained confidence, and his speech returned to normal, even carrying a hint of surprise. "This might be a good idea, Master Charles. You have too many supporters, not just in the orphanage, but also among the citizens who admire you. We should organize them to do the right thing." Darius then nodded firmly. "Yes, that's how we should do it. We can't let those stupid, greedy capitalists manipulate us. If things continue like this, France will be completely corrupted by these parasites sooner or later. We must bravely stand up and fight for the rights that rightfully belong to us." He became increasingly agitated as he spoke. "The soldiers on the front lines can't even decide what equipment they use. They have to fight with what the capitalists force upon them, and they pay with their lives for it, just because the capitalists want to make money. It's ridiculous. We must stop them." Charles nodded inwardly. He knew Darius had the potential to participate in politics. "I have nothing to do with this," Charles said softly. "It was the veterans' decision, of course." Darius nodded firmly. "In fact, the veterans have been discussing this regularly, and I was inspired by them to decide to form a political party." He spoke with confidence and conviction, and Charles almost believed him. Afterward, Charles did not linger in the factory. With a new party about to be formed, Charles thought it best to stay away and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Although everyone knew what was going on, at least procedurally, there was no problem. There was no law that prohibited Darius from forming a political party or participating in politics, no law that prohibited him, as the party leader, from taking Charles' advice, and no law that prohibited the party's members from being Charles' supporters. The reason for doing so was that Charles knew very well that relying solely on capitalists like Stead and Wells was far from enough to overpower Schneider in the House of Representatives. Ultimately, their relationship with Charles was an exchange of interests. One day, if Schneider could offer more tempting benefits, they would not hesitate to stand on Schneider's side. Stead's connections would be closer, because if things continued this way, almost everything produced by the St. Etienne arsenal would be tied to the industrial property rights owned by Charles, making it almost impossible for Schneider to offer more enticing benefits. Wells Shipyard, however, was different. Its shipbuilding industry was closely linked to Schneider's steel forging, something Charles had to be wary of. Regardless of the situation, relying on oneself is worse than relying on others remained a truth. Seeking support from others was ultimately not a solution. As for whether Darius might eventually become independent, Charles didn't think there was any need to worry. The reason was simple: this party was founded on Charles's foundation, and all its members were Charles's supporters. If Darius ever did have such thoughts, he would soon understand that going solo would simply mean going solo. Charles's thinking seemed somewhat ruthless. He had to abandon all emotions and consider issues and each ally purely from a self-interested perspective. Even a confidant like Darius, a devoted admirer, was no exception. This included Lucia and the White Lady, but Charles had no choice but to do so because he understood that politics had no room for sentiment. It was all about interests, naked interests. Chapter 263 Naval Technical Advisor. Charles didn't interfere much in the formation of the new party, nor was it appropriate for him to interfere too much. As long as the party was based on him and would rally support for him in the future, that was enough. After this matter was settled, Charles turned his attention back to tanks. He instructed Estany not to tell anyone about the direction of tank development, including the military. Estany initially expressed his confusion, "But Colonel, if we don't tell the military, wouldn't they be heading in the wrong direction?" But then Estany understood that Charles didn't want his competitors, like Schneider, to know the direction of tank development and get ahead of the competition. After a moment's consideration, Estany nodded in agreement. After all, it was Charles's tractor factory that produced tanks for France. As long as Charles and Estany knew the direction, France wouldn't go in the wrong direction. What Estany didn't know was that his thinking was judging others by one's own standards. The next day, the first thing Charles did upon returning to the city's defense headquarters was to make a request to Gallieri. "General," Charles said earnestly, "I would like to transfer a technical advisor from the naval shipyard to assist us." Shipyard? Gallieni looked at Charles with a strange expression. "You don't intend to build warships, do you?" "No, General," Charles replied. "In fact, I want to build tanks." "You should know I have two types of tanks," Gallieni hummed in agreement. "One was the Mark I, and the other was the Charles A1, but," Gallieni asked, puzzled, "isn't the Mark I tank supposed to be phased out?" "No, General," Charles replied confidently, "quite the opposite. Not only is it not being phased out, but we're going to upgrade it further." "Upgrade?" Gallieni looked confused. "Does that mean we'll still be using the Mark I in the future?" "Of course," Charles explained seriously. "These two tanks each have their strengths. The Charles A1 is fast and highly mobile, but its armor is thin and there's no extra space for a large caliber gun. The Mark I is slower and logistically difficult, but it can be fitted with thicker armor and potentially a large caliber gun, which is advantageous for attacking or destroying enemy bunkers and fortifications." Gallieni believed him immediately. After all, what Charles said seemed to make a lot of sense. After a moment's hesitation, Gallieri asked, "What does this have to do with the shipyard's technical advisor?" "We're going to make the Mark I bigger, General," Charles explained. "Its size and weight will likely be several times larger than the current Mark I, making it more like a ship. There are issues with ballast and the stress distribution on different parts of the hull, all similar to shipbuilding." Gallieri said, "Oh," and then readily agreed, "I'll contact the shipyard immediately." "No, General," Charles interrupted Gallieri, reminding him, "for security reasons, this technical advisor should ideally be from the military." Gallieri thought this made sense and nodded. "No problem, I'll notify the Admiralty to send someone." After that, Charles let things develop as they were. He didn't really want to upgrade the Mark I. France already had the Char A1, a tank with a turret. Any upgrade would be to the Char A1. Upgrading the Mark I would be redundant. But Colonel Estany reminded Charles. "To be precise." Schneider's light tank reminded Char, if Schneider was developing a light tank because of the Char A1, would the Germans have similar ideas? The Germans had ample reason to develop a light tank. Their A7V, developed at great expense, crammed with cannons and machine guns and required an 18-man crew, was utterly defeated by a 2-man tank. More importantly, Germany was France's enemy, so they didn't have the same industrial property rights issues. So what were they waiting for? Of course, they copied the Char A1. Germany was clearly more formidable than Schneider. They had a stronger industrial base, a larger and more comprehensive talent pool, and a more reliable research direction. The A7V even incorporated suspension. And what Germany developed would be used on the battlefield, in a life-or-death struggle against the Char A1. Therefore, for both public and private reasons, Char needed to dig a trap for the Germans to fall into. The most plausible trap was undoubtedly the super heavy tank. The Germans seemed to have a certain obsession with super heavy tanks, such as the Big Bertha, followed by the Paris gun, and the Gustav supertank during World War II. Even during World War II, the Germans were able to develop the Maus tank. Considering this, Charles believed that steering German tank development towards super heavy wouldn't be difficult. The challenge lay in subtly conveying the information to the Germans. Charles thought of the spy Harley, and then the Minister of the Navy. If someone could be transferred from the Navy, could information about the development of super heavy tanks be passed to the Germans through them? This led to the request made to Gallieni. Charles wasn't sure if he could succeed. Man proposes, God disposes, he thought, and decided to wait and see what tanks the Germans would send to the battlefield. In fact, Gallieni had doubts about Charles's request. He knew of Charles's relationship with Wells. Charles had recently saved Wells's son, Tigeny, and Wells enjoyed privileges in the Navy. Transferring someone through Wells would be a simple matter of a word, yet now it required going through him to contact the Navy. However, this thought only flashed through Gallieni's mind. He simply assumed that Charles was doing this to keep his distance from Wells. Soon, Charles discovered that things weren't as simple as he thought. That afternoon, Charles was surprised to find Tigeny running up to him. Tigeny was panting heavily, as if he had run all the way upstairs. He cheerfully said, "Reporting to you, Colonel." "What are you doing here?" Charles asked suspiciously. Then he glanced at the guard strangely. They shouldn't have let Tigeny in. Since the reorganization of headquarters, unauthorized personnel, including officers, were no longer allowed to freely enter and leave headquarters. Tigeny smiled slightly, pulled out a document, and handed it to Charles. "This is the transfer order, Colonel. Did you need a naval technical advisor? It's an honor to serve you. Are you the technical advisor sent by the Navy?" Charles looked at Tigeny with difficulty. This guy must have used connections to secure this position again. Otherwise, why would an Army Major General be sent as a naval technical advisor? Tigeny readily admitted it, spreading his hands. "Don't underestimate me, Colonel. I might be a comprehensive technical advisor." He then added, "Whatever the problem, I can find someone to help you solve it." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 264 Improvements to Torpedoes. Something came up today and I'm too busy to write, so there might only be 2 chapters. The other chapter will be released later. Sorry, Charles asked Tigeny with a hint of sarcasm. "You know anything about design?" "No, I don't," Tigeny answered decisively. Charles asked again, "You know anything about math?" Tigeny laughed. "I've never passed math." "Then what are you doing here?" Actually, Charles had already guessed the answer. This rich kid was here to chase after a star. Tigeny spread his hands, his face still showing grievance. "Please, Colonel, I have resources. Isn't that enough?" Charles was instantly speechless. Having resources was indeed a skill, it was just that others weren't born into wealth. Thinking about it more carefully, Tigeny's lack of knowledge was actually a good thing. Because it meant he could pass the problem to the shipyard technicians, and then the information that Charles' plans to produce super heavy tanks would quickly spread, even including Charles's design drawings. Thinking of this, Charles nodded slightly, gesturing for Tigeny to sit down in the chair in front of his desk. He took a document from his briefcase and handed it to Tigeny, patting it lightly and saying in a low voice, "This is the tank I want, General." "This is a military secret." "Understood, Colonel," Tigeny replied, flipping through the document with interest. However, he only glanced at it before staring wide-eyed at Charles in astonishment. 13 meters long, 3 meters wide, weighing 120 tons. This is a behemoth. The Charles A1 only weighs 8 tons. This is more than 10 times that weight. Of course, Charles replied, it's precisely because it's a behemoth that I need a naval technical advisor. I want to know if this design is reasonable, such as whether the steel can withstand the weight of the hull, the pressure of the tracks on the ground, and what standard tracks can withstand a weight of around 120 tons. Colonel Tycoon looked at the document with a puzzled expression, his tone slightly hesitant. You don't really intend to produce this kind of tank, do you? Is there a problem? Charles countered. No, it's no problem. Tycoon scratched his head, a hint of frustration in his eyes. Looks like I was wrong. After seeing the Charles A1, I thought tanks should be like that, there was nothing better. But now, Charles was somewhat surprised. He hadn't expected this seemingly clueless rich kid to have such insight. Tycoon clearly lacked professional knowledge, but seemed to intuitively sense the direction of tank development. His thinking even predated Colonel Estine's. Actually, Charles misunderstood. Tycoon wasn't entirely relying on intuition. Ordinary people's research and development is always inevitably drawn to the battlefield or driven by profit. Tycoon, however, elevated it to another level. He believed equipment development was an art, a process of human societal progress, a violent beauty of war. Perhaps because he stood at a different level, he could see further, more clearly, and with greater foresight. Only someone of Tycoon's background could achieve this, because ordinary people couldn't treat tanks and other equipment as toys, or appreciate warships as paintings. They didn't have those conditions. Charles didn't waste words with Tycoon. I just want the answer, General. Do you have a way to solve this? Of course, Tycoon replied with a grin. Don't worry, Colonel. I'll bring the design and the data you need tomorrow. I guarantee you'll be satisfied. Charles grunted in acknowledgement, then turned to review a stack of telegrams that Lieutenant Colonel Fernand had just handed over, seemingly telling Tycoon, get busy, don't bother seeing me out. Tycoon didn't leave. He approached with a forced smile. Colonel, we've encountered some difficulties in improving the torpedo. Charles didn't answer, continuing with his own work. If torpedoes were simple, there would be no need for your development. Tycoon, seemingly unfazed by the lack of attention, casually picked up a pencil and muttered to himself, the main difficulty is the incredibly complex hydrological conditions. After a torpedo is launched, it's easily affected by undercurrents, and we can't even predict the direction of the current, so its launch trajectory is uncontrollable. We've tried many methods, such as increasing the torpedo's speed or adding sensors for self-correction, but the results haven't been ideal. Although Char didn't intend to listen, he was still drawn to Tycoon's questions, his mind wandering even while flipping through intelligence reports. This problem also applies to artillery shells. The difference is that airborne shells are affected by wind, which is obviously much less influential than ocean currents. Furthermore, wind force is measurable in a specific area and at a specific time, for example, northwest or southeast winds, their strength, allowing artillery to correct for wind deflection and ultimately obtain a relatively accurate trajectory. Torpedoes launched from the sea cannot do this. Ocean currents might even contain eddies that could fling the torpedo in another direction. Therefore, there were instances during this period where torpedoes failed to hit their targets even at a distance of 150 meters, and there were even cases where torpedoes launched from warships would turn around and destroy themselves. Note, in 1942, the British Navy experienced such an accident. Modern torpedoes made a qualitative leap by adding gyroscopes, giving them the ability to self-correct their course. However, there is another simple and direct method. Charles pondered for a moment and replied, we might be able to solve this problem with wire-guided torpedoes. Wire-guided? Tycoon looked at Charles calmly. You mean the Brennan torpedo? This time, it was Charles's turn to be confused. He had expected Tycoon to exclaim, that's right, Colonel. We can control them to swim towards their target in the sea simply by adding a line to the tail of the torpedo. You're amazing. We never thought of that. However, Tycoon's expression was merely one of confusion, and he even uttered a term Charles didn't recognize, Brennan torpedo. Charles's reaction surprised Tycoon as well. A flicker of astonishment and admiration crossed his eyes. My God, you don't know about the Brennan torpedo, yet you still thought of using wire guidance to solve the accuracy problem. Charles understood the implication. He stopped what he was doing and turned to Tycoon. General, Do you mean that wire-guided torpedoes have already been invented? Yes, Colonel. Tidjany nodded heavily. It must have been 20 years ago. I'm not entirely sure, but the inventor was Brennan of Ireland, hence the name Brennan torpedo. Charles was a little dizzy. This was World War I, and he always assumed that the equipment of that era was primitive and outdated. He was surprised to learn that torpedoes had already advanced to the wire-guided level, and that this guidance technology was still in use even in modern times. Then Charles asked, somewhat puzzled, since such torpedoes exist, why are there accuracy issues? Charles meant, why don't you just use them? Tidjany shook his head and replied, it has significant limitations, Colonel. Many of us are discussing whether to use this method. The image above shows the Brennan torpedo, invented in 1887. A straight rod on the torpedo body is used to observe its position, and a wire is connected to the rear of the torpedo body for power transmission and control. Chapter 265 Brennan Torpedo. After listening to Tidjany's explanation, Shaw realized that a Brennan torpedo of this era was not the same as modern wire-guided torpedoes. The biggest difference was that a Brennan torpedo's wires were responsible for both control and power transmission. It's equipped with an electric motor, Tidjany explained. Our batteries couldn't store enough power to guide it to its target, and the generator was too large to fit inside the torpedo body, so we used shore-based power generation to supply it. The method of power generation made Shaw chuckle. They even equipped this torpedo with a boiler room, using the boiler room to drive a steam engine to generate electricity, which was then transmitted to the torpedo. The entire system was practically a small power plant. The image above shows how the Brennan torpedo works. It was generally deployed ashore, with a lookout tower used to observe the torpedo's direction, and personnel at base were notified by telephone to control the torpedo and correct its trajectory using a steering wheel. Clearly, such a massive torpedo mechanism could not be brought onto a torpedo boat. Even adapting it to destroyers and battleships was considered impractical. Space on destroyers and battleships was extremely limited. Creating a dedicated system for torpedoes would require a lookout for assistance, making it seem more feasible to try one's luck with traditional torpedoes. However, Charles quickly found a solution. Why don't we combine these two types of torpedoes? Charles replied, I mean, take the advantages of both. The advantages of both. Tidjany suddenly understood. You mean, equip traditional torpedoes with wires that only control the torpedo's direction? Charles nodded. The Brennan torpedo already existed at this time, meaning that electrically controlled torpedo steering systems were mature and developing them wouldn't be difficult. Tidjany paused for a moment, then suddenly stood up, his face grave. Thank you very much, Colonel. I'm not sure if this idea is feasible. I have to ask them. And of course, this, Tidjany waved the documents in his hand. I'll be back to you soon. Wait, Charles called out to Tidjany, who was in a hurry to leave. Perhaps we should discuss the issue of torpedo range. Tidjany turned around as if electrocuted, staring at Charles in astonishment. You have a way to improve torpedo range. In the 15th arrondissement of Paris, in a 5-story villa on the banks of the Seine, Wells, wearing pince-nez, was buried in a pile of design drawings, working frantically. During this time, Wells had been implementing the two directions proposed by Charles, upgrading destroyers and improving torpedoes. Upgrading destroyers posed little technical difficulty for the Brest shipyard. It was simply a matter of comprehensively considering the warship's speed, armor, and firepower. The key was that it had a clear objective. Its speed must be faster than cruisers and battleships, and its firepower and protection must be stronger than British destroyers. This creates an asymmetric competition. Those capable of defeating destroyers can't catch it, while those capable of catching destroyers are easily defeated. In a sense, it's invincible. It can roam the oceans unchallenged. However, improving the torpedo is difficult. The most troublesome aspect is that it uses compressed air to drive a turbine that powers a propeller. But compressed air contains only 21% oxygen, limiting its range to about 2 kilometers. Note, early Whitehead torpedoes had a range of only 640 meters, later reaching 10 kilometers. To increase the torpedo's range, the only option seems to be increasing its size to accommodate more compressed air. There appears to be no other way. Unless, like the Brennan torpedo, it uses electrical wires for power, which in principle would allow it to travel further. But that's only in principle. In actual combat, the length of the wires poses a risk of breakage due to their own weight, which also limits its range to 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers, this number is like a curse, tightly binding Wells and preventing him from surpassing it. All the designers and all the design proposals were incapable of achieving this. Wells grew increasingly frustrated, finally throwing all the drawings aside, fuming, and pulling out a cigar from his pocket, muttering irritably, "It's all rubbish. And some people even want to replace the air with oxygen. Don't they know that will blow themselves up?" Just then, hurried footsteps sounded outside the door. Wells knew it was Tijani. He wondered, should Tijani be at the city defense headquarters? Just then, Tijani pushed open the door and practically ran to Wells's desk, panting, "Father, we might have a way to improve the torpedo." Wells smiled, sat back down, and thought, "You, a major general?" Tijani didn't explain. He glanced at the desk, flipped through the documents and sketches, and picked up two, placing them in front of Wells. "Father, look at this." "What have you thought of?" "What?" Wells asked coldly. The two images before him were of a traditional Whitehead torpedo and a Brennan torpedo. What else could it be? Tijani didn't speak. He picked up the Whitehead torpedo, ripped off the blank tail section with a snap, and then stacked it on top of the Brennan torpedo. Wells was first stunned, then his pupils gradually widened. Wire-guided? Wire-guided Whitehead torpedo, yes, Tijani nodded heavily. We only control it, not supply power. Therefore, we only need a very thin, very light wire, plus a battery that doesn't require much power, to control the Whitehead torpedo. Tijani nodded thoughtfully. The wire was also a major issue. If only control commands were transmitted and no power was needed, it could be made thinner, which meant lighter weight, and lighter weight meant a longer launch range. But soon, Wells's burning gaze dimmed again. A longer wire range wasn't that important, the air supply was still insufficient, that was the key. Tijani seemed to see through Wells's thoughts, and continued, "Father, regarding range, Charles's idea is that if we can't find something else to replace air, then we should find something else to replace explosives and fuel." Explosives and fuel? Wells looked at Tijani with confusion. "Yes," Tijani explained excitedly. "For example, for the same amount of explosives capable of penetrating a battleship, a more powerful explosive formula requires a smaller volume, and the same goes for fuel. If we can save space on both explosives and fuel, we can fit more compressed air." Wells's eyes lit up. A novel idea, and the logic was simple, but everyone's attention was focused on the difficulty of compressed air, neglecting the easier to improve explosives and fuel. Thinking of this, Wells couldn't help but beam with joy. He realized that choosing to support Charles was the right decision. His talent could bring about a revolutionary change to the Navy. Chapter 266 The Role of Formulas. During this period, TNT was the common explosive charge in torpedo warheads. For ordinary bombs or shells, TNT was sufficient and required no improvement. In fact, TNT was quite advanced for its time. Note, TNT was used as an explosive around 1907. Before that, picric acid was used, and for nearly 40 years after its invention, TNT was used as a bright yellow dye for cotton, silk, and even hair. The image above shows hair dyed yellow with TNT. At the time, it was called tar. However, when used in torpedoes, TNT was not necessarily enough because torpedoes needed to conserve space to carry more compressed air. Germany was the first to consider improving explosives. In 1907, they mixed 60% TNT and 40% hexanitrotoluenylamine, HND, and found that its explosive power was 7% stronger than 100% TNT. This meant that to penetrate the same battleship, the torpedo's explosive volume could be reduced by about 7%. This was a German military secret, unknown to the Allied powers at the time. However, Charles knew of a more advanced formula, the SW9, a torpedo explosive used in the later stages of World War II, consisting of 50% TNT, 10% hexanitrotoluenylamine, 5% aluminum nitrate, and 35% aluminum. The key ingredient was aluminum, which releases a large amount of heat when burned, making its explosive power about 70% stronger than 100% TNT. Furthermore, aluminum's density is nearly twice that of TNT, allowing for a warhead with this formula to almost have the explosive charge. If the fuel were changed to dicahydronaphthalene, which has a higher calorific value, the torpedo's range could easily double or even exceed that. Note, during World War II, torpedoes using this explosive and fuel could achieve a range of 6 kilometers at a speed of 44 knots, and even 14 kilometers at a low speed of 20 knots. These improvements weren't difficult, the key was the formula. Knowing the formula simply meant finding the raw materials, Without it, even racking one's brains was useless, requiring trial and error to determine the proportions of each ingredient. Charles didn't intend to provide an answer so quickly. The main reason was that France didn't have a significant need for torpedoes, and the German Navy had British backing. Charles's ultimate goal in improving torpedoes was to suppress the British Navy, a long-term plan, not something to rush. At the same time, Charles believed that what he gave Wells should be given little by little, like squeezing toothpaste, to keep him hooked and supportive. If he gave him all the technology at once, capitalists would, by their very nature, turn their backs and side with Schneider. Alternatively, Charles thought he could keep the advanced formulas for himself. For example, starting with the Germans' original formula of 60% TNT and 40% HND, then SW18, then SW36 and SW39, and finally SW39A. So many intermediate formulas plus fuel, wouldn't that overwhelm him? However, Charles was frustrated to find that he only remembered the proportions of the final form, SW39A, he had no recollection of the others. This was troublesome. But then Charles thought again, it didn't matter if he didn't remember. He could just modify the correct formula, add aluminum nitrate first, then aluminum, and mess around with the proportions. As long as there was a slight improvement each time, it would be enough to keep Wells completely confused. Charles was secretly pleased with himself, only Charles could come up with such a method. Just then, a staff officer guarding the telegram exclaimed, "The Navy has launched an attack on the Dardanelles." With that, the staff officer quickly delivered the telegram to Gallieni's desk. Such urgent telegrams could be sent directly without going through Charles. Gallieni glanced at the telegram and looked at the staff officer with suspicion. "What happened yesterday?" "Yes," the staff officer nodded, "probably for security reasons." Gallieni hummed in agreement. He didn't take it too seriously. The Navy's actions didn't really need to inform the army. However, in Charles's eyes, this was a joke. The Germans might have already known about this from Harriet, even the detailed battle plan, but the French second-level command wouldn't know until a day after the start of the war. Gallieni pondered for a moment, then summoned his staff, including Charles, for a short meeting. He waved the telegram in his hand. The initial main battleship fleet consists of 16 battleships, 4 from France and 12 from Britain, a considerable force. They likely hoped to force the Ottoman Empire to surrender with their navy, but yesterday's battle did not go smoothly. They failed to break through the Dardanelles, not even destroying a single turret. If the war continues like this, it may be necessary to launch a frontal assault by the army to tie down the Germans. "Do you know what to do?" the staff officers answered one after another. "Yes, General." "Understood." Before a major battle, preparations must be made for manpower, supplies, transportation, medical care, and even equipment upgrades. The staff officers were already adept at this. The crowd dispersed to their respective tasks, but Charles was stopped by Gallieni. "Colonel." Gallieni looked at Charles meaningfully. "Don't you have anything to say?" Charles had previously advised Albert I to land from the north, but now the Allied fleet was attacking from the south. Did this mean Charles's advice had been abandoned? "No, General," Charles replied calmly. "I have nothing to say." Gallieni paused, then smiled slightly and nodded. Charles's attitude had already given him the answer. Charles's composure meant his advice hadn't been abandoned, and the Allies were likely doing exactly what he suggested. In other words, the attack on the Dardanelles was a feint, and the Allies' main attack was still from the north. Gallieni hadn't expected that. While he had guessed the first part correctly, he hadn't guessed the second. The Allies were indeed attacking according to Charles's plan, but it was a trap within a trap, a reversal that had even confused the shrewd old general, Gallieni. Gallieni didn't waste any time on this. He took a document from his drawer and handed it to Charles. "This is a light machine gun designed by the Pitot Arms Factory. I'd like to hear your opinion." No one knew more about equipment than Charles, a capitalist, and Gallieni believed he needed Charles's approval before placing an order. Charles took the document and glanced at it. It was indeed the Chauchat machine gun. It seemed Steed had successfully transferred the design to the Pitot Arms Factory. Charles pretended to consider it for a moment, then replied with a somewhat uncertain expression, "It seems there aren't any major problems. After all, our army lacks light machine guns. On the other hand, it's difficult to judge a machine gun's performance from blueprints. Its shortcomings are often only discovered on the battlefield." The first part was encouraging Gallieni to buy it, while the second part was a precaution. If the Chauchat machine gun later revealed many problems, That wouldn't be Charles's responsibility. Gallery agreed, "That's what I think too. Light machine guns are urgently needed on the battlefield. Let's order a batch first and see how it goes." Absolutely, Charles thought. Only if the military orders and is likely to place further orders will the Pido Arms factory expand production. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. Charles wanted this newly transformed arms factory to take a nasty fall. Chapter 267 Super Heavy Tank. In the early morning in Berlin, Wilhelmstrasse was blanketed in snow. The overnight snowfall had smoothed the street like a mirror, or a cream cake, with a few scattered tire tracks and footprints serving as decorative borders. In the General Staff meeting room in Fouquet Hall, military representatives and representatives from the 7th Transportation Division were locked in a heated debate, the atmosphere seemingly more intense than the blazing firewood in the fireplace. At its most heated, they even considered challenging each other to a duel to settle the matter. The focus of their argument was the direction of tank development. The military representative was Major General Fine, commander of the A7V tank unit, who possessed the most practical experience in armored warfare. At this moment, Major General Finn, his face flushed and neck red, roared at the person opposite him, "We risked our lives fighting the enemy on the battlefield, we watched helplessly as the Charles A1 tank destroyed the A7V, and the A7V was utterly powerless to retaliate. At that time, we knew that this was the kind of tank we needed, and only this kind of tank could win. This experience was bought with blood and lives. It's unbelievable that you still think your design direction is correct." Sitting opposite him was Major General Luca, the representative of the 7th Transportation Division. The 7th Transportation Division, officially the 7th United Front Transportation Division, was responsible for the management and design of military vehicles, including tanks. The A7V tank was delivered to the battlefield in less than a month under Major General Luca's command. Although the A7V tank suffered a defeat, Major General Luca's position in tank development and design remained unshakable. Major General Luca met Finn's aggressive gaze head-on and replied firmly, "You're right, General, the A7V did indeed suffer a defeat. But have you considered why the A7V failed? Perhaps it wasn't because it was too big, but precisely because it wasn't big enough. If our tanks were large enough to have cannons on every side, would we have encountered the situation where the Charles A1 circled around us and couldn't be aimed? Please tell me, how would the Charles A1 defeat us then?" Major General Finn couldn't refute this. After all, if a tank was covered in cannons like a hedgehog, a light tank like the Charles A1 would inevitably suffer devastating damage if it got close. Major General Finn seemed to sense something was amiss, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. He could only answer, "The question is, how long will it take us to get such a tank? Until we get it, are we supposed to use rudimentary anti-tank rifles to deal with the Char A1? The French are already mass-producing the Char A1, and soon they'll be appearing on the battlefield in droves, while our super-heavy tanks are still in the factory." Major General Luca couldn't refute Major General Finn either, because a super-heavy tank would take at least several months, or even longer, to develop, and the situation on the front lines seemed too urgent to wait that long. His answer was, "We don't necessarily have to produce tanks to deal with the enemy's tanks. There are many ways to deal with it. Its frontal armor is only about 20 mm. We can consider using artillery, or increasing the caliber of anti-tank rifles, or even developing new types of grenades." Falkenham sat at the head of the long table, resting his chin on his hand, frowning as he silently listened to the debate. Both sides had their reasons, and it was difficult to determine who was right. From the perspective of immediate urgency, developing light tanks was appropriate, but in the long run, super-heavy tanks seemed to be the trend. It's like a warship. Battleships dominate with their massive tonnage, heavy armor, and large-caliber guns. This seems to imply that light tanks are destined to be obsolete, so why not go straight for the best? After a moment's thought, Falkenhayn said, "Gentlemen," the two factions, who had been arguing fiercely, slowly stopped, but their eyes were still filled with resentment, and they continued to formulate their arguments for the next debate. Falkenhayn glanced down at them, intending to end this pointless argument. "I've never commanded tanks, nor have I designed them. I'm an amateur in front of you, therefore, I cannot give you advice, much less persuade you, but I do know one thing." Falkenhayn straightened up, slowed his pace, and said in a low voice, "Charles chose a tank like the Charles A1, and so far, he has not made a mistake. Never, ever." At this, everyone fell silent. It was true, every choice Charles made was correct. From the initial original tank to the Mark I, and then to the Charles A1, each tank inflicted heavy losses on the German army. Major General Fine, understanding the implication in Falkenhayn's words, or perhaps inspired by him, excitedly chimed in, "I agree with Your Excellency the Chief of the General Staff's point. We can certainly refer to the French tank development process. Besides the Char tank, France also had Schneider Saint-Chamond and CA-1 tanks. They were similar to our A-7V tanks, with larger hulls and cannons, but Char insisted on using machine guns, ultimately only mounting a single 37mm cannon on the Char A-1 tank. Furthermore, this small cannon was primarily used against tanks. Machine guns were still more active in frontline combat. Why is that? Do you think Char was a fool? Didn't he know to make the tank bigger and cram everything in? Major General Fine's words completely stumped the men of the 7th Transportation Department. A dozen or so people, including Major General Lucas, were speechless, and many even began to doubt their own reasoning. Because Char was a benchmark, whatever he did, Germany followed, and there were basically no problems. From this perspective, they must have been wrong. The atmosphere in the meeting room then eased, and the people from the 7th Transportation Department seriously considered whether they should abandon the super heavy tank and turn to designing a light tank. At this moment, a staff officer hurriedly entered the meeting room, handed a document to Falkenhayn, and whispered a few words. Falkenhayn's expression changed slightly, and he immediately opened the document and began to read it, his expression becoming complex, sometimes surprised, sometimes confused. Both groups, puzzled, looked at the Chief of the General Staff in unison. After a long while, Falkenhayn sighed, leaned back in his chair, waved the document in his hand, and said, "Gentlemen, these are the design drawings for Charles's new tank. You may not believe it, but this is a super heavy tank, heavier and larger than any tank we have ever thought of." Everyone's expression changed upon hearing this. Especially Major General Finn, who knew that the direction of tank development was about to shift to super heavy tanks again. Major General Lucas was somewhat proud, because this meant that his direction was correct, and Charles had given him the strongest support with practical actions. Chapter 268 Development Funding. The image below shows the super heavy K-Wagen tank produced by Germany during World War I. It was designed to weigh around 100 tons, but the final production version weighed 150 tons. The military ordered 10 tanks at 600,000 marks each, with a top speed of only 7.5 km per hour and a normal cruising speed of 1.9 km per hour. By the end of the war, only one was roughly completed, but it was never used in battle and is therefore unknown. Incredibly, Charles's tank design bore a striking resemblance to the tank being designed by Major General Lucas, at least in several aspects: a weight of around 100 tons, cannons on all four sides, and frontal and lateral armor approximately 30 mm thick. Major General Lucas was visibly excited, almost incoherently stating, "Yes, this is what I want. God, Charles and I are on the same page. This is the kind of tank we need. This is the direction tank development should take." Without a doubt, is there a reason? Falkenhayn had to carefully consider this proposal. Major General Lucas confidently replied, "Of course, Your Excellency Chief of the General Staff. 30 mm thick armor can withstand most bullets, including the Char A1 feet 37mm cannon. Add to that 4 70mm cannons in 4 directions and 4 machine guns, and the vehicle's weight will inevitably reach 100 tons. Falkenhayn nodded slightly. Therefore, this was no coincidence, but an inevitable consequence of designs converging on the same concept. Major General Finn's position instantly weakened. He remained silent for a while, then asked weakly, "So, when will we receive this tank?" This was a familiar question, and Major General Lucas knew Finn would follow up with, "If it takes several months or even a year, what will we use to counter the Char A1 during that year?" Major General Lucas gave an answer that satisfied both sides. "If possible, we will design a light tank while producing the super heavy tank. Of course, we will also consider other anti-tank solutions." With that, Major General Lucas turned his gaze to Falkenhayn, requiring Falkenhayn's approval. Falkenhayn hesitated for a moment, then nodded and replied, "That's a good idea. Light tanks will be used to solve the immediate crisis, and heavy tanks will be used to decide the outcome." Thus, the problem was solved. Paris City Defense Command. Charles took some time to visit Lucia at the Officers' Club. Lucia, as before, teased Charles with a mix of genuine and feigned interest. Charles, surprisingly, seemed somewhat used to it. As Lucia leaned in for a tender nuzzle, Charles gently bit her ear. This startled Lucia. She jolted as if electrocuted, turning to stare blankly at Charles, her eyes filled with shock, her once fair face instantly turning as red as wine. Charles felt a surge of pride. He felt he had found a way to deal with Lucia. What? Charles's tone was full of provocation. Should I tone it down? Lucia's eyes darted around. She seemed to understand Charles's intention. After a slight hesitation, she timidly leaned forward and gave a seductive replying, "Yes, Colonel, you'd better." However, Lucia was thinking, only if he thinks I'm afraid will he continue to do this next time. Charles's face showed a victorious smile. In his opinion, everything Lucia did was an act. As long as he was bolder, she would be the one embarrassed. Charles didn't know that he had unknowingly fallen into the gentle trap of the female spy in front of him. Getting back to the point, Charles leaned close to Lucia's ear and whispered, "Are all your people in Belgium?" Lucia smiled slightly. "Where do you think I am, Colonel?" This made Charles realize that he had asked a stupid question. Lucia answered softly, "Currently, there are 23 people in Belgium, or rather, 23 families, because they usually gather intelligence with their families." Charles said "Oh," and nodded in understanding. For example, monitoring trains isn't something one person can do all day. 3 or more people must take turns to ensure the train data is recorded without omission. Another 10 are in France, Lucia continued, and 5 are in the Netherlands. Most of those in France are responsible for transporting intelligence. Charles hummed in agreement. Ordinary people in this era didn't have radios, and using telephones was extremely risky, so intelligence had to be concealed on the person and passed from person to person. In the later stages, when the lady in white had grown in power, the Germans even erected an electric fence along the French-Belgian border to prevent her from sending intelligence to the Allies, but it was still ineffective. It was unimaginable. A self-organized spy organization could be so successful, and now she was following Charles and accepting his leadership. "You need to develop your own power," Charles said. "Every country does this. I can provide you with funding." Lucia hesitated, then shook her head slightly, her tone firm. "No, Colonel. We don't need any funding, and if there were any financial dealings, we would easily be exposed." Charles interrupted Lucia. "If my girlfriend needs money, and I happen to be very rich," Lucia fell silent instantly. Charles was right. If Lucia and Charles were a couple, accepting Charles's funding would be normal. "It's settled then," Charles said firmly. "If you accept my leadership, you shouldn't question my orders." "Yes, Colonel," Lucia replied helplessly. She knew Charles was right. Funding was essential for the team to grow quickly. However, the lady in white wanted a purer relationship with Charles. They weren't wealthy. In fact, most of them were poor. Some were teachers, some were full-time housewives, some were farmers, and they believed that they shouldn't ask for anything in return for their contributions to the country. Tentatively, "We'll have an infantry company." Charles was responding to the lady in white's request. They wanted to be treated as soldiers, not spies. "The company commander will be elected by you," Charles continued, "with a corresponding rank and allowances equal to those of the troops." "Colonel," Lucia's eyes flashed with fear, "once they receive allowances, they'll be easily exposed." Charles understood what he meant. A soldier's allowance of 20 francs a month might not seem like much, but for an ordinary family, it could be double their salary, instantly easing their financial burden. "That's up to you," Charles insisted. "You can consider donating your allowances to the organization's operations." Charles didn't want to owe them anything, especially these selfless individuals. Lucia nodded slightly, leaning closer and whispering in Charles's ear in a retaliatory manner, "I agree, Colonel, a very good idea." Chapter 269 Greville's Cooperation. Saint-Étienne, more than 400 kilometers from Paris, is the 14th most populous city in France. Greville sat alone by the window at Café Weber, sipping his coffee and watching the massive chimneys outside, constantly billowing thick, black smoke, puffs of which occasionally punctuated by sparks, like ink sprayed high into the sky, turning the entire sky black. Even the snow on the ground and rooftops was covered with a thin layer of black specks. Everything was gray, including the suffocating air. Who would have thought that just decades ago, Saint-Étienne was a quiet town with a population of only a few thousand? During the industrial boom, various minerals were discovered in Saint-Étienne, especially coal, which brought energy, wealth, and prosperity to the town. The metallurgical, mining, metals, and textile industries flourished here, and France's largest arms factory was also located here. Greevy turned his gaze back to his coffee and suddenly noticed how similar its color was to the black smoke, including the burnt taste and its bitterness. Why hadn't he noticed this before? Greevy sighed softly and placed a coffee cup back on the tray. Just moments ago, he had been craving coffee to stimulate his groggy mind, but now he had lost interest. He hadn't spent over 7 hours on the train for this. "Don't you like the coffee here?" Rayam smiled and sat down in the chair opposite Greevy. "No," Greevy forced a smile. "I'm just not quite used to it here." Greevy gestured with his chin towards the window. Rayam nodded understandingly. "You'll get used to it after a while, it's not easy." The waiter brought Rayam a cup of coffee, and after thanking him, Rayam looked at Greevy. "Besides, you don't seem to need to get used to it," he was subtly asking Greevy's purpose for coming. Greevy and Rayam weren't exactly acquaintances. When Dominic was in high school, Greevy had helped Dominic a lot, for which Rayam, as his older brother, was grateful. Greevy picked up the coffee spoon and gently stirred the contents of his cup, though he no longer intended to drink it. "You may have heard something about Charles," Greevy asked. He didn't intend to beat around the bush with Rayam, because Rayam was different from Dominic. He was a shrewd businessman who had always managed the arsenal in Saint-Étienne. "Yes," Rayam frowned slightly, thinking he had guessed Greevy's purpose, to inquire about the equipment Charles was developing. "Hand grenades, mortars, 37mm cannons, aerial bombs." Greevy shook his head and smiled slightly, an incredulous expression mixed with a hint of respect in his eyes. "Enviable, wouldn't you say?" Rayam coldly replied. "That seems irrelevant to you, Greevy. If you want information about this equipment, you'll be disappointed." No, you must understand," Greevy replied. "You know, I have absolutely no interest in these things." Rayam then remembered that Greevy was a representative of opposition to industrialization. Rayam had been so busy at the arsenal that he had overlooked this. So, Rayam looked up and met Greevy's eyes directly. "You didn't come here just for coffee, did you?" Greevy smiled slightly and said unhurriedly, "I hope to cooperate with you, Mr. Rayam." "Cooperate?" Rayam laughed. "Is there room for cooperation between us? Are you currently interested in industrial or military equipment?" Greevy shook his head and explained. "You seem unaware of the kind of cooperation your father is undertaking with Charles." This question stumped Rayam. Steed hadn't told him, he only knew that Saint-Étienne and Charles each received 50% of the profits. That was fine, it was a win-win situation. "It's not as simple as you think, Rayam," Greevy continued, his tone tinged with sarcasm. "You know, the equipment currently produced by the Saint-Étienne arsenal will one day be obsolete, all of it, without exception. And what's obsolete will be replaced with equipment invented by Charles." Rayam's eyes widened suddenly. He hadn't considered this at all. Not long ago, he had been excited about Charles's amazing creativity and the practicality of these equipment. Now, reminded by Greevy, Rayam immediately realized something. If Charles had 50% control over all the invented equipment, and everything produced by the Saint-Étienne armory in the future was invented by Charles, wouldn't it mean Charles would have absolute say in the Saint-Étienne armory? "As far as I know," Greevy added, "your father has such plans. He's completely won over by Charles, and he wants Charles to lead the Saint-Étienne armory, not just a simple collaboration." "No, that's impossible," Rayam interrupted Greevy. "His father was a shrewd businessman. He couldn't possibly hand over his life's work to an outsider, even if it was Charles. If it were anyone else, it would indeed be impossible," Greevy replied, his voice cold, as if describing Rayam's cruel future. "But that person is Charles, and you know very well what kind of strength Charles possesses. His talent is innate. He is a genius military strategist and inventor. Inventing equipment is just one part, a small part, of his many abilities. What's even more terrifying is that his creativity seems endless." Rayam remained silent. He knew Greevy was telling the truth. No one in this world could compete with Charles. While others were thinking about making money by producing cannons, warships, and airplanes, he simply filled gunpowder into wooden and iron shells to create hand grenades, easily achieving that dream, even earning more than building warships. Greevy continued, "Your father clearly knew he couldn't compete with the Charles, so he decided to become part of the Charles." To be precise, Greevy paused intentionally, emphasizing his words, his voice low. It should be, surrender. This word deeply wounded Rayam's pride. He gritted his teeth, frowned, and complained, "Foolish. That's surrendering without a fight. Hearing this, Greavy knew he hadn't made a mistake. From the beginning, he should have approached Rayam first, not Dominic. Rayam was Steed's chosen successor to Saint Etienne, and Saint Etienne's future was inextricably linked to him. Dominic, on the other hand, was only interested in guns and cared nothing for the succession. Naturally, he wouldn't care about the Charles's threat to Saint Etienne. Perhaps that was why Dominic had rejected him, Greavy thought. Chapter 270 Internal Problems. Rayam carefully considered Greavy's words. He believed Greavy was right. Before this, Rayam hadn't realized that Charles was a potential rival, but now it dawned on him. If things continued this way, Charles, not him, would eventually possess Saint Etienne. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Rayam understood what Greavy meant by cooperation. It was about dealing with Charles. However, you are powerless against Charles. Rayam's gaze was suspicious as he scrutinized Greavy. You cannot compete with Charles in industry, and Charles is under the tight protection of the military. You can't do anything. Rayam wanted to know if Greavy was worth cooperating with. If he was only good at talking, there was no point in cooperating. Instead, he would be used as a pawn to fight Charles. His father and brother might also be involved. A hint of embarrassment flashed in Greavy's eyes. Rayam was largely right. Greavy indeed couldn't do anything. All he could do was try to win over forces with potential conflicts with Charles. Interests? This approach seemed to offer no benefit to the right wing. In fact, they were wasting money on these things. The goal? Greavy's initial idea was to use capitalists to defeat each other, creating internal strife, ideally forcing Charles to join his system. However, Greavy realized he was too naive. Charles's inventions came one after another, like a tidal wave, multiplying his assets several times over in just a few months, even expanding overseas, leaving Schneider scrambling to keep up. Forcing Charles back? Charles didn't feel the pressure from the right wing at all. Instead, the right wing felt the pressure. Many in the right wing felt that the agricultural society was gone forever, and Charles would lead French industry to new heights. But Greavy remained unwilling to give up. This wasn't the country and society he wanted. This wasn't the future of France. Especially sitting here seeing the bleak Saint Etienne, his resolve was strengthened. I can't offer you anything, Mr. Rayam. Greavy leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice, but Schneider can. Rayam instantly understood. Greavy was there to connect him with Schneider. In the conference room of the Ritz Hotel in Paris, a machine gun with a circular magazine sat on the table. Steed opened a bottle of champagne and personally poured one for Charles. Dominic also took a glass. He never drank alcohol because it made it impossible for him to see the sights and fire. He hated the feeling of holding a gun but unable to hit the target. Whenever that happened, he felt like his hands, eyes, and even his brain weren't his own. But today, at this moment, Dominic felt he could have a drink, for the birth of this machine gun. It's heavier than the Chochet machine gun. Dominic, holding his glass, kept his eyes fixed on the machine gun, a smile playing on his lips. The Chochet weighed 9 kilograms, this one weighs 9.1 kilograms, but it's still superior because it can hold 47 rounds, while the Chochet only holds 20. Dominic turned to Charles, his eyes flashing with admiration and surprise. We simply enlarged the disc by a few centimeters, and it can hold 7 more rounds. Unbelievable. This is normal. Enlarging the diameter increases the circumference. The circumference and diameter are related by and the number of rounds that can be squeezed in is determined by the circumference. Steed stepped forward, patting the machine gun and nodding in satisfaction. We conducted rigorous firing tests on it, and of course, compared it with the Chochet machine gun. Its failure rate is significantly lower than the Chochet, and its sustained firepower is particularly outstanding. If we use 2 spare barrels instead of 1, its rate of fire is even comparable to a heavy machine gun. This was somewhat exaggerated. In actual combat, a light machine gun can't fire 250 rounds continuously from a single belt like a Maxim. Changing magazines and barrels would keep the assistant gunner busy for quite some time. However, this was enough to demonstrate the superiority of the rotary machine gun. Then Steed changed the subject. The Pitt Arms factory is already producing the Chochet, so shouldn't we? We can wait a bit longer. Charles interrupted Steed. Let's put this machine gun into production first. Steed was taken aback. Should we give it to the military for testing first? Most weapons production involves producing samples for the military to test, and then mass producing after receiving orders. This reduces the company's risk considerably. Otherwise, They might produce a large number of machine guns but have no buyers. Father, Dominic said with a confident smile, the colonel is right. You don't need to worry about this machine gun not selling. It will be snapped up as soon as it hits the market, Dominic added, including the international market. Charles nodded inwardly. Dominic might not understand business, but he understood guns. Steed's concerns vanished after Dominic's reminder. He was also confident in the machine gun, but in modern French society, excellence didn't guarantee success. Parliament had to make the decision. Just as Charles's superior tanks always lost in Parliament, Steed worried that a large batch of machine guns produced would end up piling up in warehouses, unwanted, because of parliamentary obstacles. But Dominic's mention of including the international market made Steed see the light. If France didn't want it, they would sell it to Britain, Russia, and the United States. Unlike France, they didn't openly use inferior products instead of superior ones. That was the ugliness of capitalists. Steed seemed to have forgotten that for 7 years before the war, the Saint-Étienne machine gun had suppressed the Hotchkiss due to the ugliness of capitalism. Then, Steed understood Charles's intention. He raised his champagne glass and looked at Charles with admiration. If we start mass production now, and one day it reaches a certain scale, suddenly releasing it onto the market could potentially eliminate all the Chauchat machine guns currently in mass production, dealing a heavy blow to the Pitot arms factory. This was exactly what Charles was thinking, but he added, ultimately, what will strike at the Pitot arms factory is the rifle. Yes, Steed agreed, we're already developing bullets. He then turned his gaze to Dominic. Dominic nodded in response. Perhaps we'll have results next week. We're also considering the rifles to match. Charles hummed in agreement, saying casually, perhaps you should consider internal issues more. Internal issues? Steed looked at Charles with confusion. Dominic was equally bewildered. What internal problem? What does Charles know? How does he know? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 271 Business Intelligence. If it were the old Charles, he would have known virtually nothing about the outside world except for military intelligence. Even if he knew something, it would be outdated, useless, or even a carefully crafted lie by his adversaries. But now, Charles had the lady in white. The lady in white might not be suited for spying on business intelligence. Charles worried she might resist. After all, they demanded to be treated as soldiers, and soldiers cannot point their guns at civilians. But Lucia offered a very reasonable explanation. Your factory is producing equipment needed on the front lines, Colonel, and this equipment is defeating the enemy. Anyone who harms your factory is hindering our victory. That makes sense. Charles nodded, readily entrusting the task of tracking Gravy to the lady in white. Thus, Charles learned that Gravy had gone to Saint-Étienne to meet with Liam. Although he hadn't heard the details, anyone could guess Gravy's purpose. Furthermore, Charles also knew that Gravy had recently been in close contact with Bonnet, the owner of the Little Daily. This made Charles realize that there were many people in the alliance with whom he had conflicting interests, even though the alliance was formed for mutual benefit. For example, Steed's eldest son, Liam, could have inherited Saint-Étienne, and he had been fighting for it, even operating Saint-Étienne as his own arsenal long ago. But now, Charles's existence might disqualify him from the inheritance. More precisely, not from the inheritance itself, but from becoming Charles's puppet if he inherited Saint-Étienne. At least that's how he perceived it. The Little Daily also clashed with the Hero's Daily. While Steed was willing to sacrifice the Little Daily to fully support Charles, Bonnet was not. The Little Daily was his everything. He didn't want to be used as a pawn or as a mere follower of the Hero's Daily, much less watch the Hero's Daily steal all his readers without any chance to fight back. Therefore, the best option for the Little Daily was to align with Schneider. The party affiliation seemed to make little difference to him. Steed listened to Charles's account with a dark expression, then looked at Charles apologetically. Please believe me, this wasn't my intention. I didn't know any of this. He also came to see me, Dominic said. I mean, Gravy, he came to see you. Steed looked at Dominic in shock. Yes, Dominic replied, his expression slightly embarrassed. At the time, I thought he just wanted to sow discord, but I didn't expect it to be. Steed snorted and glared fiercely at Dominic. What do you plan to do? Charles asked. Don't worry, Colonel. A cold glint flashed in Steed's eyes. I'll handle these matters. Steed had already decided that Bonnet would die in a traffic accident. At this time, Bonnet hadn't publicly announced his intention to switch allegiance to Schneider. If he died unexpectedly, everyone would suspect Schneider, and Schneider would suffer a loss, gaining nothing in the process. As for Liam, he would forever lose his right to the inheritance, and knowing too many secrets, he would be under house arrest for at least the time being. And perhaps it would be safer to entrust the management of St. Etienne to a third party with no inheritance rights. Steed simply lacked creativity, but that didn't mean he lacked methods. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived this long in a society where factional strife was like a battlefield. After considering for a moment, Steed bowed slightly to Charles. I hope these unpleasant things won't affect our cooperation. Of course, Charles replied calmly. However, I might be able to offer you some advice. Steed was somewhat puzzled. Did Charles want to vent his anger in his own way? Then a flicker of fear flashed in Steed's eyes. Would Charles ask him to sacrifice his own family for the greater good? If so, what should he choose? Steed gritted his teeth, deciding to sacrifice Ram. After all, compared to a family in St. Etienne, Ram was insignificant. However, Steed quickly realized his mistake. Don't worry about Bonnet, Charles said. All you need to do is persuade Ram. Persuade? Steed looked surprised. This punishment seemed too lenient. Ram could become a pawn in our hands, Charles explained. Next time, you won't need to transfer the blueprints to the Pitot armory by firing technicians. Steed suddenly understood. Schneider's potential use of Liam is likely to be to strengthen the Pitot arms factory to suppress St. Etienne, or more precisely, to undermine Charles. For example, if Charles makes any inventions, the Pitot arms factory can obtain the blueprints in advance and produce similar equipment. If this is the case, Liam could potentially be used against him. Steed was confident. I can persuade him, Colonel. If he refuses, he will have nothing, but Steed was still unwilling to let Bonnet go. But the little Daily has a significant influence on us. His influence is negligible, Charles interrupted Steed. Steed was somewhat troubled. It seemed to have little impact on Charles. Even Schneider's Morning Post had to publish Charles's successes and victories, and the little Daily would do the same even if it defected. Even if he wanted to manipulate the narrative, he couldn't portray a victory as a defeat. But the blow to the Republican Party's cohesion and morale. Charles seemed to see through Steed's thoughts and added, even if you want to deal with him, it will take some time. Hearing this, Steed understood. This wasn't Charles being soft-hearted, but rather he was dealing with another person, Greevy. Steed was right. In Charles's eyes, Greevy was always his most important adversary. Greevy's existence was like an anti-Charles alliance, connecting all of Charles's enemies, some even those Charles himself wasn't aware of. Greevy was a smart man. If Steed dealt with the two traitors cleanly and efficiently, Greevy would immediately realize the danger. Charles possessed intelligence capabilities, and he would have to be extra careful in his future actions, even knowing what he couldn't do. But if Charles seemed oblivious, if Bonnet remained loyal to Schneider, and if Liam continued to provide intelligence to Schneider, then Greevy would continue his clandestine dealings with the Germans as before. Before that, Charles might have been powerless against him, but now, with the Lady in White watching Greevy, and more importantly, Greevy unaware of the Lady in White's existence, then Greevy and the right wing would face the charge of treason. What would the outcome be? Suicide, or execution? You choose. Chapter 272 The Patchwork Tactic. To Stead's relief, Bonnet hadn't publicly declared his departure from the Republican Party. Stead guessed that Schneider wanted Bonnet to remain hidden within the party, waiting for a crucial moment when the tabloid would suddenly change its tune and expose some unfavorable comments about Charles, throwing Charles into disarray. Since Bonnet hadn't made a move, Stead pretended not to know, happy to see him continue this pretense. As for Liam, Stead, under the arrangement of Security Captain Klein, secretly went to the St. Etienne arsenal. When Stead suddenly appeared in Liam's office and took control of everyone there, Liam realized he'd been exposed. Father, Liam's face instantly drained of color, and he rose from his desk in a panic. Klein moved a chair and placed it in front of Liam, and Stead slowly sat down, squeezing out a few words through clenched teeth. What did Schneider offer you, Father? I didn't. Liam seemed to want to argue, but Klein's pistol was already pressed against Liam's head. Klein was less a security captain and more the commander of Steed's private army, who had been protecting Steed's safety for years, including eliminating his rivals. Be careful. A flash of murderous intent crossed Steed's eyes. I don't want to hear any lies. You know what I'm willing to do for the family's interests and Saint Etienne's future." Liam dropped the pretense and retorted sharply, "The family interests and Saint Etienne's future you're talking about, do you mean handing it over to Charles? What will we get in return?" Seeing Steed remain silent, Liam mustered his courage and continued, "Father, even without Charles, Saint Etienne is at least our family's." "Is that so?" Steed coldly retorted. "Over the years, what new equipment has Saint Etienne invented under your management?" "What I've seen is it being eroded bit by bit," Liam countered. "Even so, it doesn't mean we have to surrender to Charles." Steed abruptly stood up and slapped Liam hard to the ground, cursing him with exasperation. "Fool! Without Charles, we might even be defeated by the Pinto Armory. Do you think Charles can't rise without our support? Do you think Charles needs us? Do you think we're irreplaceable? Is it that Charles can't produce hand grenades, mortars, aerial bombs, or 37mm cannons?" Liam was stunned. As the manager of the Saint Etienne arsenal, he knew perfectly well that producing these weapons was extremely simple, especially hand grenades, which only required a few workers and some training. Therefore, it was Saint Etienne that needed Charles, not the other way around. Without Saint Etienne, Charles could easily find any arsenal or even open his own. Then, these weapons would spring up like mushrooms after rain. At that time, the largest arsenal in France would be the Charles Arsenal, and Saint Etienne, without new weapons, would be quickly eliminated under the combined attack of several forces, beyond anyone's help. Steed looked at Liam, who was sitting on the ground in a daze, and gently shook his head. "You still don't understand. The future of the arsenal lies in creativity. Whoever controls the creativity controls the power. All you see are factories, workers, and machines. Why don't you consider, can all of that compare to a grenade that Charles casually drew?" Liam felt he had done something foolish. His father's chosen path was likely the right one. Factories, workers, even machines could easily find substitutes, but creativity couldn't. Charles had such creativity, each one enough to shake Saint Etienne, and there might be more to come. Therefore, Charles was undoubtedly the king of the military industry. His father realized this and chose to fully support him. Only in this way could he obtain the greatest benefit and lead Saint Etienne to glory. But he had treated it as surrender without a fight, even hoping to cooperate with Schneider to drive away Charles, this threat. At the City Defense Command, Charles received a call from Steed, knowing that he had successfully persuaded Liam. Charles wasn't too concerned about this matter. From the moment Liam was being followed in Grevy, his scheme was destined to be exposed. If the plot were exposed, Liam would only have one option, to be persuaded. After all, Liam was at the Saint Etienne arsenal, and after this incident, Steed would certainly keep him under tight protection. Charles's attention was mainly focused on the Dardanelles Strait, and intelligence reports were being delivered to General Gallieni one after another. Gallieni summarized the battle. "The number of battleships has increased to 18, along with dozens of cruisers and destroyers, but it seems to have had little effect. They don't even dare to enter the strait to fight. Can't these battleships force their way through?" Gallieni was an amateur in naval warfare, but he believed that battleships could force their way through the Dardanelles Strait with their speed and armor, and that once they entered the wider Sea of Marmara, they could seize the initiative in the war. "Mainly mines, General," Charles replied. "A single mine can sink a battleship, and the Ottomans have laid mines throughout the narrow strait." Gallieni waved the documents in his hand. "They also brought many minesweepers and destroyers. The minesweepers and destroyers can lead the way, with the battleships following behind. The Ottomans have found a clever countermeasure," Charles explained. "Their cannons are ineffective against battleships, but they are enough to sink minesweepers and destroyers. Therefore, they choose to concentrate their firepower on the minesweepers." Gallieni said "Oh," and said nothing more. The war should indeed be fought as Gallieni suggested, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and minesweepers all at once, with minesweepers and destroyers clearing mines in front, and the main battleships following behind. Although there would be casualties and costs, as long as they pressed forward, the fleet could quickly pass through the Dardanelles Strait and enter the Marmara Sea. However, Vice Admiral Carden, the fleet's commander-in-chief, remained hesitant. He worried that if the fleet suffered heavy losses fighting a small country like the Ottoman Empire, his command would become a laughingstock worldwide. Therefore, Vice Admiral Carden consistently employed what he considered a more reliable tactic. During the day, Warships would bombard coastal defenses from a distance, while minesweepers would secretly enter the strait at night to clear mines. This seemingly safe approach actually gave the enemy more time to react, ultimately turning into a piecemeal tactic. Once the enemy grasped the pattern, they immediately implemented countermeasures, hiding their cannons during the day and attacking minesweepers at night while replenishing their torpedoes. Vice Admiral Carden naturally assumed the enemy was an inflexible fool. Chapter 273 28 Days of Procrastination. The Ottomans and Germans were virtually unprepared for the Dardanelles. This was what General Winter told Charles, who excitedly telegraphed him, "Your plan is a success, Colonel. Our intelligence indicates that the vast majority of the more than 100 cannons the Ottomans possess in the Dardanelles are outdated, dating back over a decade. No more than 20 are new cannons capable of threatening battleships. At the same time, the enemy is short of supplies, ammunition, and mines. Many of these mines are even Russian mines, laid by the Russians in the Black Sea, which, having broken their chains, drifted downstream to the Sea of Marmara and were found and reused by the Ottomans. The Ottomans and Germans have clearly been fooled. They are completely unprepared for the Dardanelles, and victory is in sight." However, the situation was not as optimistic as General Winter had imagined. Vice Admiral Carden's piecemeal tactics constantly gave the enemy opportunities to rest and replenish their supplies, even teaching the defenders how to fight. Charles watched helplessly as the excellent opportunity he had created was wasted by the foolish commanders of the British Royal Fleet. Finally, even the British couldn't stand it anymore. The Admiralty sent 2 telegrams to Vice Admiral Carden: "If the fleet suffers losses due to the attack, or even if the entire operation fails, the responsibility will fall on the First Lord of the Admiralty. You only need to consider your mission and the enemy before you." The meaning of the telegrams was clear: fight with confidence. If you lose, it's your superior's fault. If you win, it's yours. But Vice Admiral Carden still couldn't face the battle head-on. The next day, he left his post to recuperate at the rear due to health reasons. Before leaving, he recommended Rear Admiral Robeck to take over command, but Rear Admiral Weems had higher seniority than Rear Admiral Robeck, and the fleet debated this for 3 days. It wasn't until Rear Admiral Robeck was urgently promoted to Vice Admiral that the issue was resolved. By this time, 28 days had passed since the fleet approached the Dardanelles and fired its first shot. Charles's eyes were dark-rimmed. He sent a telegram to General Winter: "This battle has been lost." The wise choice is to withdraw. General Winter arrived at Charles's office that afternoon. He looked very haggard, as if he had been busy with the Dardanelles battle all this time. Charles led General Winter to the conference room and, before the general had even settled in, confidently told him, "No one can sustain a feint attack for 28 days. Even the dumbest Germans can guess that our main attack target is the Dardanelles." "You're right, Colonel," General Winter said dejectedly. "Now, no matter how much we bluff in the north, it's useless. The Germans are transporting large quantities of torpedoes, along with artillery and shells, to the Dardanelles." "So, you still harbor illusions about this battle?" Charles asked. "In principle, as long as the Ottoman Empire had enough mines, the British fleet would never be able to pass through the Dardanelles." General Winter looked at Charles expectantly. "I want to know, do you have any other ideas? For example, perhaps we could actually land in the north." Charles shook his head. "It's been almost a month, General. We've kept the Germans thinking we're landing in the north, and they've made ample preparations there." This was a consequence of a double deal. Originally intended to mislead the Germans, it had now eliminated the possibility of a landing in the north. Charles gently advised General Winter, "The only thing you can do now is to make them stop. If you give the enemy a month to prepare, or even train a large number of soldiers who know how to defend the strait through live-fire exercises, there's only one possibility for defeating them: the Ottoman Empire will surrender." General Winter frowned and sighed. "You may be right, Colonel. But I can't convince them. The First Lord of the Admiralty believes that the previous failure to achieve victory was due to General Carden's cowardice, and now it's Rear Admiral Robeck." Charles interrupted General Winter. "The Dardanelles Strait has also been equipped with German-made mines, more and more advanced than before, and Rear Admiral Robeck may not know this. He may not even have any command experience." General Winter's face turned ashen. After a long silence, he nodded heavily. "I'll give it a try. If we let the First Lord of the Admiralty launch an attack, it could be a disaster." With that, General Winter hurriedly left. He had always traveled by train from Ypres, but now he went straight to the airport. He needed to hurry back to England to talk to the First Lord of the Admiralty. However, Charles knew he couldn't convince the First Lord of the Admiralty. The First Lord had famously declared, "If we lose the Dardanelles attack, I'll go to the front as a soldier." Therefore, he couldn't easily admit defeat, even knowing victory was virtually impossible. Sure enough, the day after General Winter returned, the Allied fleet launched a full-scale attack on the Dardanelles. The staff officers at the city's defense command cheered upon hearing the news, chattering amongst themselves, "Give them a taste of their own medicine. Those are 18 battleships. They should have razed the Ottoman Empire to the ground long ago. I bet they'll break through the strait today." 18 battleships, including HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's most advanced super-dreadnought battleship. But the battleship's performance was a complete disappointment. They couldn't hit targets while moving, in bad weather, or at long range. Only calm seas, clear weather, and close-range firing worked. The fleet's performance plunged everyone into a state of disappointment and depression. Now, they believed their time to triumph had arrived. Gallieni's eyes held a hint of worry. He glanced at Charles and whispered, "This isn't your plan, is it?" Charles could only offer a wry smile. The battle seemed to be progressing smoothly. This was the first time warships and mine-sweeping operations had been conducted simultaneously during the day. Although they hadn't witnessed the battlefield, intelligence seemed to paint a picture of the operation. Both sides were engaged in a fierce artillery duel, with battleships leading other warships in a simultaneous barrage of fire on enemy fortifications and artillery batteries. Battleships, heavily armored and equipped with massive cannons, shifted positions in the azure waters, engaging enemy batteries under heavy fire. Cannons roared in unison, and in the thick smoke and dust, fortifications were engulfed in massive fireballs. On the hills on both sides of the strait, the Ottoman Empire's cannons roared in response. Mobile artillery, which normally only operated at night, was now forced to face the naval gunfire in broad daylight. Allied destroyers and minesweepers led the charge through towering columns of water, clearing obstacles for the battleship's advance. Just then, a telegram brought good news: "Our troops have hit the enemy's ammunition depot." The command post erupted in cheers, and everyone felt that victory was just around the corner. Chapter 274 Missed Opportunity. The city's defense headquarters was filled with laughter and jubilation. The staff officers even secretly started betting, not on the fleet's victory or defeat, but on whether the fleet would break through the Dardanelles Strait and enter the Sea of Marmara today or tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand secretly asked Charles, "Colonel, aren't you participating?" Charles coldly replied, "What are the odds of defeat?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand paused, then chuckled, "Defeat? Nobody thinks the fleet will lose. If someone does, I'd bet 1 to 100 against them." "As you wish." Charles reached into his pocket and slapped all 11 francs in front of Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand hesitated, looking at Charles's resolute expression. But then he thought, this battle couldn't be lost. Those were 18 battleships, all of Germany only had 17. They were enough to destroy a country, especially against the Ottoman Empire. Thinking this, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand generously accepted Charles's 11 francs, proudly waving it in front of Charles. "I'll consider it a treat for me." However, at that moment, a communications officer suddenly cried out, "General, the Bouvet has been sunk." The Bouvet was one of the 4 battleships sent by France to cooperate with the British fleet. Perhaps driven by pride, the French hoped their battleships could achieve a more dazzling victory than the British in this battle, and therefore everyone wanted to know their status and held high hopes. Unexpectedly, the first piece of intelligence they received was that it had been sunk. The command post fell into deathly silence. Everyone, including Gallieni, stopped what they were doing and stared in shock at the communications officer. Only Charles sat calmly in his chair, drinking apple juice, available at the officers' club for 10 centimes a cup. After a long pause, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand exclaimed, "No, this is impossible." "How was it destroyed?" The communications officer repeatedly confirmed the intelligence, but still dared not answer, ultimately choosing to hand the telegram directly to Gallieni. Gallieni glanced at it and read the contents aloud. 1:54 p.m. Gallieni took out his pocket watch and checked the time. It was already 3 p.m., meaning the incident had occurred an hour earlier. If it had happened an hour earlier, it was almost certainly true, as the City Defense Command's intelligence came from headquarters, and headquarters would verify its authenticity. Gallieni frowned and continued, "The Bouvet sank in an explosion of unknown origin, seemingly from an ammunition depot explosion. It happened suddenly. From the explosion to the sinking, only 2 minutes and 35 seconds, leaving us no time for rescue. Of the 648 officers and men, only 5 officers, 9 petty officers, and 33 sailors survived. Headquarters fell silent again, seemingly mourning the fallen. But they quickly returned to normal. They had experienced similar things far too many times. 600 officers and soldiers were a small number. A single battle in the army resulted in thousands or even tens of thousands of casualties. If it weren't for the fact that this invincible symbol of battleships sank in just over 2 minutes, they might not have even had a moment of silence. This could be an accident, Felsen sighed softly. For example, improper operation, or enemy shells detonating the ammunition magazine by some coincidence, the others agreed. In their view, the Ottoman Empire could not possibly sink a battleship, not even one. Charles, however, shook his head slightly. They, including the fleet, hadn't realized it was a mine. But this seemed normal. A loud bang detonated the ammunition magazine inside the battleship, the violent explosion visible to the naked eye, and it sank in just over 2 minutes. Even the officers and soldiers on board at the time couldn't understand the cause of the explosion. An accident? Or did a large caliber enemy shell penetrate the armor? Whatever it was, no one suspected a mine, because a mine's explosion should have occurred under the hull. However, this sowed the seeds for other warships to strike mines. An hour later, another telegram arrived at the City Defense Command. The battlecruiser Indomitable struck a mine and is severely damaged. 3 minutes later, the battleship Unimpeded struck a mine and is taking on severe flooding. We have abandoned ship. Half an hour later, the battleship Ocean rushed to the rescue, struck a mine, and is listing severely. We have no choice but to abandon ship. This series of mine-struck reports left the entire command staff bewildered. They couldn't imagine that the nearly invincible battleships were so vulnerable. One after another, they succumbed to the mines. By this time, darkness was falling, and the battle had to be hastily ended. Because battleships might face greater danger in the dark, they couldn't even see the mines floating on the surface. The final result was, 3 battleships sank, and 3 other battleships were severely damaged and had to withdraw from the battle. This all happened in one day. Out of a total of 18 battleships, 6 were sunk or damaged in a single day of fighting, not including the cruisers and destroyers sunk or damaged by enemy bombs. If the fighting continued like this, the Allied fleet, seemingly massive and initially boasting of forcing the Ottoman Empire to surrender, would only last 3 days. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand immediately realized the fleet's attack had utterly failed. After suffering such heavy casualties, further attacks were impossible unless they intended to sacrifice the entire fleet. He handed the 11 francs back to Charles, saying with difficulty, I still owe you 1,100 francs, Colonel. Charles smiled slightly. No need, Lieutenant Colonel, consider it my treat to drink. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's eyes widened instantly. 1,100 francs for a drink? Too bad he wouldn't have that luxury. Charles rose and walked towards Gallieni, handing him today's report. This was an additional task Charles had taken on after being promoted to colonel. He needed to analyze and evaluate intelligence daily, serving as a general summary. Gallieni glanced at the report after receiving it and said, "You don't seem to have analyzed the naval battle." Charles was taken aback. "I thought that wasn't within our purview, General, or the Army. Any intelligence within this operations department falls under your purview," Gallieni replied sternly. "You should know that naval operations can potentially affect the Army. Its strategic objective might even be to flank the Army's defenses and open a new front. Otherwise, why would you send naval intelligence to us?" "All right," Charles said with a hint of helplessness. "The Navy failed because they missed a crucial opportunity. If they had fought like this on the first day, the Ottoman Empire might have already surrendered." Gallieni paused for a moment, then nodded slightly in agreement. On the first day, the Dardanelles Strait didn't even have many mines. It was even navigable the day before. The image above shows the Ottoman mine Lehr Nusret, whose German carbon explosive mines destroyed 3 battleships and severely damaged 1 in a single day. A replica of the ship was later placed in a park in Turkey as a memorial. Chapter 275, Second Round. As darkness fell, the Parisian winter was bitterly cold, especially in the final moments before nightfall, when the last vestiges of light and warmth were instantly extinguished, leaving only endless darkness and chill. The French Defense Intelligence Service, also known as the Second Directorate of the French General Staff, was often simply referred to as the Second Directorate or the Second Bureau. Captain Gabriel, a member of the counterintelligence team at the Military Intelligence Bureau, stared blankly at the telegram in his hand under the lamplight. The telegram was from Captain Watson of MI6, the head of MI6 in France. Coincidentally, Captain Gabriel and Watson had been classmates during their training in Britain. Perhaps because of this connection, the two cooperated closely, sharing intelligence and exchanging counterintelligence knowledge and experience. Captain Watson complained in the telegram, "This battle has been lost, utterly and completely lost. Unbelievable. The Royal Navy has squandered the opportunity that Charles bought for us with such inefficiency." This wasn't news. Captain Gabriel knew the outcome of the Dardanelles offensive immediately. What interested him was the last sentence, "Squandered the opportunity that Charles bought for us." What opportunity? How did Charles secure it? Did Charles collaborate with MI6? Charles is French. The British know what he did, yet the Second Directorate, the French intelligence agency, didn't. A disgrace to the Second Directorate. Thinking deeper, Captain Gabriel believed it was likely related to espionage. Previously, Captain Gabriel had found it strange that the Allied invasion of the Dardanelles lasted 28 days, yet German reinforcements to the Ottoman Empire were only seen at the very end. This wasn't typical German efficiency, especially considering the Germans' higher regard for the Ottoman Empire and their efforts to win it over. It was Charles's doing. Captain Gabriel keenly sensed Charles's possible involvement in this operation and how he had somehow deceived the Germans. And to make the Germans completely believe him, there seemed to be only one way, to use German spies against them. Thinking this, Captain Gabriel jumped up from his chair and said to his assistant, "Binova, go to the city defense headquarters." The city defense headquarters. Binova followed behind, his tone slightly nervous. "Captain, if we're going there to investigate someone, shouldn't we write an application or ask Major Duro?" "No, we're just going to see an acquaintance," Captain Gabriel explained as he put on his cap. "It's not official business." Captain Gabriel thought this might be an opportunity to earn merit. He might catch a big fish. Binova felt a little relieved upon hearing this. People from the Second Bureau weren't exactly welcome, especially since it was the city defense headquarters. However, when they showed their identification and entered the city defense headquarters, Binova realized his mistake. Captain Gabriel walked straight to Charles, who was about to leave work, saluted, and extended his hand to introduce himself. "Hello, Colonel. My name is Gabriel, from the Second Bureau's counterintelligence team." Binova instantly turned pale with fright. Captain Gabriel was looking for Charles, and he even went to the city defense headquarters to look for him. He must have gone mad. Sure enough, the staff officers who were about to disperse stopped in their tracks. And Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, who had already gone downstairs, was called back. They surrounded Captain Gabriel and Benoit with hostile expressions. Galeri had already returned to the lounge, fully clothed, and was lying on the bed waiting for the orderly to bring dinner when a communications officer suddenly ran in to report, "General, the Second Bureau is here to see Charles." Galeri was startled, jumped up without even putting on his hat, and quickly walked out of the lounge. Galeri's haste wasn't to protect Charles, but to protect those clueless people from the Second Bureau who dared to break into the city defense headquarters to arrest a spy, and Charles no less. They would be beaten up and thrown out by the staff officers at headquarters, and if the Parisian citizens along the street knew about this, they would continue to do so. Sure enough, when Gallieni reached the operations department, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand grabbed him by the collar and said in a provocative tone, "This isn't a place for you, Captain. There are too many military secrets here that you shouldn't know. I have reason to believe you're here to spy." "Stop," Gallieni shouted, walking forward as the crowd parted to make way for him. "Excuse me, General," Captain Gabriel quickly explained, "I just wanted to ask Charles a few questions." Gallieni interrupted Captain Gabriel. "You know what the procedure is?" Captain Gabriel replied, No, there's no need to follow the procedure." At this moment, Major Dura rushed in, shouting at Gallieni from a distance, "General, this is a misunderstanding. Gabriel is an admirer of Charles, he just wants to talk to Charles about personal matters." Gallieni raised an eyebrow. He recognized Major Duro, the head of the Second Bureau's counterintelligence team. His presence here must indicate something important, not what he claimed. Charles remained silent throughout, only offering a slight smile, finding it somewhat unbelievable that the Second Bureau was only now realizing this. Wasn't it a bit too late? Major Dura and Gabriel sat in the back seat of the car returning to the intelligence office, his face grim and silent the entire way. Finally, Gabriel spoke first. "Major, Charles must know something. You idiot, Major Dura coldly interrupted Gabriel. Since you can guess that it was a trap Charles set for the Germans, yet you don't realize what you're doing? What do you think the outcome would be if this trap were still in progress? Gabriel was stunned, suddenly understanding, if this matter involved military secrets, secrets that could even influence the outcome of the Dardanelles campaign, his rash action would not only fail to catch the big fish but would also expose the trap Charles and the British had set for the Germans. Thinking of this, Captain Gabriel broke out in a cold sweat. This wasn't just a matter of ruining his future, the entire Second Bureau could potentially be implicated. Major Dura gritted his teeth in fury, nearly drawing his revolver to shoot this opportunistic captain dead. How dare you, a mere captain, mess with Charles? Major Dura had suspected something was amiss but hesitated to act rashly. He hadn't expected this ungrateful captain to barge in. Charles, though only a colonel, could be involved in a national-level campaign like the Dardanelles, and this guy dared to talk to him. If he hadn't seen that telegram and guessed Gabriel would come here, things could have gone terribly wrong. No, perhaps already had. If there were German spies in the city's defense headquarters or nearby, Gabriel's actions today would certainly have aroused their suspicion. Now, he could only hope this secret was a thing of the past. Otherwise, the entire Second Bureau might be disbanded. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.